She donated $22 million in front of 500 witnesses, and not one of them saw the men who had come to take her. Victoria Hawthorne stood beneath the chandelier light, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands she didn't want to shake, while somewhere in the back of her mind a quiet alarm was screaming. The faces were wrong. The positions were wrong. And the man nearest the east exit, the one wearing a Meridian Hotel security badge, had a scar along his jaw that she had never seen before tonight. She had 3 minutes, maybe less, before everything in that ballroom changed forever. If this story already has your heart racing, hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The Meridian Grand Ballroom was the kind of place that made people feel important just by walking into it. 12-foot ceilings, Italian marble floors polished to a mirror shine, crystal chandeliers that threw warm gold light across 500 guests in evening wear, all of them holding champagne flutes, all of them performing the specific kind of effortless sophistication that took years of practice to fake convincingly. The Hargrove Children's Foundation Gala happened every year in late October, and every year it drew the same mixture of genuine philanthropists, ambitious climbers, and people who simply wanted to be seen in rooms like this one. Logan Pierce was not any of those things. He stood near the far end of the bar, nursing a glass of sparkling water he hadn't asked for, wearing a rented tuxedo that was half an inch too short in the sleeves. He'd borrowed the jacket from his neighbor Dale, who was roughly his height, but considerably less broad across the shoulders, and the fabric pulled tight across Logan's back in a way that had bothered him for the first hour, and now he'd mostly stopped noticing. He was 33 years old, and he hadn't been to an event like this in probably 4 years. He wasn't sure he'd ever been comfortable at one. The only reason he was here tonight was Cora. His daughter was 8 years old and obsessed, with the kind of total consuming passion that only children can sustain, with the Hargrove Foundation's after-school reading program. She'd been part of it for 2 years since the September after her mother died, and it had done something for her that Logan hadn't been able to do himself. It had given her a place where she could just be a kid who loved books, without anyone looking at her the way people looked at kids who'd lost a parent. Her program coordinator, a cheerful woman named Ms. Del Rey, had asked if any parents wanted to volunteer at the gala. Logan had said yes before he fully thought it through. His job tonight was to stand near the silent auction tables during the first 2 hours and answer questions about the Foundation's reading initiative. He'd done that. He'd been thorough about it, actually, because being thorough was the only way he knew how to do anything. Now the dinner portion of the evening was underway. The auction tables were unmanned, and he was supposed to mingle until the keynote address. Logan Pierce did not mingle. He stood at the bar and watched the room the way he always watched rooms. Not with anxiety, but with the quiet, automatic attention of someone who had spent years in environments where missing a detail could mean a body bag. He noticed things without deciding to. The 2 men near the service entrance who hadn't touched their food. The way the taller of the 2 kept his right hand slightly behind his back, wrist canted inward, the way you held your hand when you were used to carrying something there. The security guard stationed at the east exit, Logan had clocked him 40 minutes ago and logged him, because that was habit, had been replaced. Same post, different man, different build. The replacement was slightly shorter and stood with his weight distributed differently, heels down, the kind of stance that came from tactical training rather than hospitality work. Logan noticed all of this the way you notice a clock ticking in a quiet room, somewhere in the background. Present. He was not alarmed yet. He was simply paying attention. Halting. Victoria Hawthorne had given the donation speech 4 times in rehearsal and once tonight, and she still didn't entirely love the opening line. Her communications director, a precise and humorless man named Jeffrey, had written it, and it had that particular flavor of corporate sincerity that she always found slightly embarrassing. But the check was real. $22 million, the largest single charitable contribution the Hargrove Foundation had ever received, and the room's reaction to it had been genuine. People had actually stood up. Some of them had cried. She didn't have the heart to tell Jeffrey that the applause was for the number, not the line. Victoria was 30 years old and had been the CEO of Hawthorne Capital Group for just under 3 years. She'd inherited the role the hard way, not through death, as people sometimes assumed, but through a boardroom fight that had lasted 11 months and left her with a reputation for being both brilliant and difficult, a combination that men found threatening and women found either inspiring or exhausting depending on the week. She had learned early to keep her face composed in public, to let other people read into it whatever they needed to read, and to save her actual expressions for the elevator ride back to the parking garage. Tonight her face was doing a great deal of work. She was sitting at the head table, speaking in low tones with the foundation's executive director, when the first thing she noticed arrived not as a visual but as a feeling, a wrongness in the room. She'd felt it before, in contentious board meetings, in negotiations where someone was playing a longer game than they'd disclosed. The specific texture of a situation that was not what it appeared to be. She excused herself quietly, pressing her napkin to the table, and stood. The ballroom was large enough that she could move without attracting attention if she chose the right pace, purposeful enough to look like she was heading somewhere, unhurried enough not to trigger anyone watching. She moved toward the east side of the room, where the floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city, picked up a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray, and turned in a slow half-circle as though admiring the view. She counted. 5 men, possibly 6. Stationed at intervals that felt wrong for venue security. Too spread out, too deliberate, too coordinated. 2 near exits, one close to the main stage, one she'd already noticed by the bar who hadn't moved in an hour, one more near the service corridor whose body language was utterly different from the 2 actual Meridian Hotel employees flanking him. The earpiece. She caught it on the man by the service corridor, a small flesh-colored nub in his left ear that was slightly too large to be invisible under the ballroom lighting. Hotel security at a gala this size wouldn't need active comms. Maybe for a head of state, not for a charity dinner. Her pulse spiked once, hard, and then she breathed through it the way she'd learned to breathe through things. Not suppression, just management. She kept her face at the appropriate setting, pleasant, slightly distracted, the kind of expression people wore when they were running through a mental to-do list at a social event. She needed to think. The exits were covered. Her phone had shown no signal for the past 20 minutes, which she had initially attributed to the building. Old hotels sometimes had dead zones, but now reconsidered. She looked at the bartender near the north wall, the one she'd spoken to earlier about the sparkling water shortage, and watched him try twice to check something on his phone and then give up with a small, frustrated exhale. Jammed. The whole room was jammed. They had planned this, planned it carefully and over a significant amount of time. You didn't place this many bodies inside a gala without advance access to the guest list, the floor plan, the security rotation. Someone with access had helped them. Someone close. Victoria set her champagne glass down on the nearest table without drinking from it. She needed someone, not hotel management. She had no way of knowing how deep the compromise ran. Not her own security team. 2 of the faces she'd already flagged were wearing Hawthorne Capital security credentials, which meant her team had been either replaced or supplemented without her knowledge. She needed someone who was here by chance, someone she hadn't brought, someone who couldn't have been anticipated. She scanned the room carefully, face still composed, eyes moving with the controlled patience of someone who had learned that panic was simply wasted time. She saw him near the bar. He was standing apart from the nearest cluster of guests by about 6 feet, which in a room this crowded was a deliberate distance. He wasn't on his phone, wasn't scanning the room with the restless energy of someone bored at a party. He was just standing there, glass in hand, watching. But not the way civilians watched. His eyes moved in a specific pattern, unhurried but systematic, pausing on the exits, the staff positions, the corners of the room. He'd noticed the same men she had. She could tell because his gaze lingered in the same places hers had, for the same measured beat, before moving on. She didn't know who he was, she didn't know anything about him. She walked toward him anyway, because she didn't have a better option, and because in her experience the people worth trusting were usually the ones standing slightly apart from everything else. Logan saw her coming from about 30 feet out. He recognized Victoria Hawthorne. Anyone in this city who followed business news would have, and he followed business news mostly because he taught economics electives and needed to stay current. But recognition wasn't what caught his attention. It was the way she was moving. The pace was perfect, entirely appropriate for a CEO navigating her own gala, but there was something in her eyes that didn't match the rest of her, a specificity of purpose. She wasn't moving toward him because he was near the bar, or because she was making rounds. She was moving toward him because she had decided to. She stopped about 2 feet away and turned slightly, as though looking past him at something near the window, creating the impression for anyone watching that they'd simply ended up standing near each other. She lifted her champagne glass without drinking. "You've been watching the room," she said. Her voice was very quiet. Not a whisper. A whisper drew attention, just a register below the surrounding noise. "So have I." Logan said nothing. He waited. "The man at the east exit has been replaced in the last hour," she said. "The two near the service corridor have comms. The signal in this building is jammed." She paused. "I counted 5. I think there may be 6. 6, Logan said. "There's one more near the stage left curtain. He's been there since before dinner." Victoria absorbed this without expression. "You're not venue security?" "No." "Foundation volunteer?" "Reading initiative. My daughter's in the program." Something in her face shifted slightly. Not much, but he caught it. She looked at him for the first time with a different kind of attention. "Can you help me?" she asked. 2 words. 3, technically, with the auxiliary verb, but the weight of them was something else entirely. She asked without performance, without the kind of careful framing that people used when they wanted to seem less afraid than they were. She was afraid. She was handling it, but she was afraid, and she wasn't pretending otherwise. Logan looked at her steadily. "Tell me what you know about how they got in." They talked for 4 minutes, standing shoulder to shoulder near the window with the city spread out behind the glass, and in 4 minutes, Logan had a cleaner picture of the situation than he'd managed to assemble on his own. Victoria was precise. She didn't editorialize, and she didn't panic spiral. She gave him facts in the order she'd acquired them, flagged the uncertainties without dwelling on them, and let him ask the follow-up questions that mattered. Someone inside her organization had helped. The security rotation had been altered without her knowledge. At least 2 of the men in the room were wearing Hawthorne Capital credentials. She didn't know if this was about her personally, about the company, or about the merger that had been all over the financial news for the past 3 weeks. A $9 billion deal that had at least 2 competing firms furious enough to litigate publicly. Logan figured the merger was probably relevant. "Your phone is dead?" he asked. "No signal. Everyone's is." "Then there's a jammer somewhere in the building, inside the ballroom or just outside it. It's directional, not a blanket. I checked my signal in the lobby bathroom an hour ago, and it was fine." Victoria blinked. "You were checking." "Habit." He scanned the room again, locating each of the 6 positions he'd identified, measuring distances and angles. "The exits they haven't covered are the kitchen and the north maintenance corridor, but I guarantee they've got people outside both of them. This is a containment operation, not an ambush. They want to move you, not hurt you here. Too many witnesses." "That's a small comfort." "Yeah," he said, because it was. A waiter moved between them briefly, and they both went quiet, faces neutral, and then the waiter was past them, and they continued. "There's a man," Logan said, "about 65, sitting at the 3rd table from the stage. Gray hair, blue tie. He's been nursing the same drink for 40 minutes, and every time one of the 6 shifts position, he watches." He paused. "Do you know him?" Victoria didn't look immediately. She waited a count of 3, then let her gaze travel the room at a social pace until she reached the 3rd table. She studied the man for a moment with the same careful blankness she'd worn all evening. "Arthur Callahan," she said. "You know him?" "He came up in my foundation research. Retired. Defense Intelligence Agency, I think, or something adjacent to it. He's been on the gala guest list for 6 years. He donates to the reading program." She paused. "He was watching them." "He made them before I did," Logan said. "He's been tracking their positions for at least an hour. See the way he's sitting? His chair is angled 6 inches off the table's axis. He moved it. He wanted the sight lines." Victoria was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "What do we do?" Logan looked at her. He thought about Cora, who was at home with Dale's wife, who had agreed to babysit without asking too many questions, who would wake up tomorrow morning and want pancakes, and to show him whatever she'd drawn the night before because she always drew things when she couldn't sleep. He thought about the woman standing next to him, who had done something real with money that most people only accumulated, and who was standing here composing herself under conditions that would have broken most people's composure entirely. He thought about 300 and some odd innocent people in evening wear who had no idea what was about to happen to them. First thing, he said, is I need to talk to Callahan. Touched out. Getting across the ballroom without being flagged required the kind of ordinary social behavior that Logan was genuinely bad at. He stopped at one table to congratulate a couple on the foundation's growth. He didn't know them, but they assumed he did and responded graciously, which was how these events worked. He picked up a fresh drink he had no intention of consuming. He moved toward the stage as though interested in the silent auction items displayed along the near wall, pausing to look at a framed photograph of the children's hospital wing that would receive Victoria's donation. He arrived at Arthur Callahan's table from the east side, which put him in the old man's peripheral vision before he was directly in front of him. He gave that a deliberate beat before approaching. He didn't want to startle someone who'd spent decades in intelligence work. "Mind if I sit for a moment?" Logan said. "I've been on my feet." Callahan looked up at him. He had the kind of face that had probably been handsome once and had since become something better, deeply lined, patient, with eyes that were alert in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine. He studied Logan for approximately 2 seconds, which was enough time to register the too-tight jacket, the sparkling water, the specific way Logan had approached from the east rather than the obvious front. "Not at all," Callahan said. Logan sat. He didn't lean in. He kept his posture loose and his voice at conversation level, because leaning in and going quiet was exactly what you did when you were conspiring, and the man by the stage left curtain had a good angle on this table. "You're not Foundation staff," Callahan said pleasantly. "No, you're the gentleman who donated the literacy collection 3 years ago, the Steinbeck first editions." Callahan smiled slightly. "You've done your homework." "Not really. Ms. Delray mentioned it." He took a sip of his drink. "My daughter's in the reading program. She thinks you're responsible for her Steinbeck phase, which I'm choosing to view as a net positive." Something shifted in Callahan's expression. Warmer, but also more attentive. "How old is your daughter?" 8, going on 40. He set his glass down. "I've been watching the room for the last hour." "So have I," Callahan said, and his voice had changed. Still pleasant, but different. "I counted 6. 7, Callahan said. "There's one in the sound booth you may have missed. He arrived during the cocktail hour." Logan filed this away. "Ms. Hawthorne has noticed. She asked for help." Callahan was quiet for a beat. Then, "She's composed." "She is." Logan paused. "We need to find the jammer, and we need a line out. I can get across the room, but I need to know the building." "I arrived an hour before doors," Callahan said, and Logan understood without being told that this was not coincidence. Callahan had been watching for something, had perhaps been warned, or had developed enough concern through his own channels to show up early and learn the layout. "The jammer is most likely in the utility corridor running parallel to the ballroom's north wall. There's an access panel near the coat check, behind the service staff station. It's a common placement, close enough to be effective, obscured enough for deniability if someone stumbles across it. Can you get to it?" "I'm 67 years old and I have a moderate heart condition," Callahan said, and he said it without self-pity, just precision. "I can get to the coat check. Whether I can handle what I find there depends on what it is." Logan looked at him. "Former DIA, you said." "I didn't say." "No," Logan agreed. "You didn't." Callahan smiled again, for real this time. "I can handle a jammer. I need 20 minutes from when I give you the signal, maybe less." Logan looked toward Victoria across the room. She had returned to the head table and was speaking with the Foundation director, her face perfectly composed, her hands resting calmly on the table in front of her. She needs to keep everyone calm and keep their attention away from the exits. She can do that. "And you?" Logan set his napkin on the table and stood. "I need to figure out what we have to work with." Callahan nodded once. "Son," he said, and Logan paused. "Whatever you were before tonight, you haven't forgotten any of it." It wasn't a question. Logan didn't answer it like one. He picked up his glass, smiled the bland social smile he'd been practicing all evening, and walked back toward the bar. He crossed paths with Victoria at the edge of the dance floor, a natural enough intersection at an event where people moved constantly. They stood side by side watching the small string quartet that had begun playing near the stage, and he gave her the shape of the plan in under 90 seconds. Callahan would move on the jammer when Logan signaled. Once the signal was restored, Callahan would use his phone to reach law enforcement. Victoria would keep the guests grouped toward the center of the ballroom. The speeches were about to resume, which would naturally concentrate the crowd and put distance between civilians and the men positioned near the exits. "And you?" Victoria asked. "I'm going to make it harder for them to move when they decide to move." She looked at him. "How?" He thought about how to say it in a way that was honest without being alarming. "By being somewhere they don't expect me to be." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "You have a daughter." "Yeah." "You should—" "I'm already involved," he said quietly. "The moment I noticed them, I was involved. That's just how it works." She held his gaze. He could see her thinking, weighing, the way she weighed everything. Not impulsively, but not slowly either, with the specific tempo of someone who made decisions for a living and had learned to trust her own read. "Don't get killed," she said finally. "That's the plan." She turned back toward the head table, and he watched her go. Her posture straight, her pace measured, her expression revealing nothing to the room full of people who had no idea that the woman they'd just applauded for $22 million was walking back into the lion's mouth on purpose. Logan finished his sparkling water, set the glass on the nearest surface, and began making his way toward the north wall. The night was about to get considerably worse before it got better, and he was the only person in this room who was even close to ready for it. The north wall of the Meridian Grand Ballroom was not a place guests wandered without purpose. It ran behind the main service station, a long stretch of paneled wall interrupted by two unmarked doors and a curtained alcove where the catering staff staged the next course before it hit the floor. Logan had clocked this area during his first 30 minutes in the building, filed it the way he filed everything, and now he moved toward it with the unhurried confidence of a man who belonged wherever he decided to stand. That was the trick of it, and it wasn't even really a trick. It was just that most people read intention off posture, and if your posture said, "I am exactly where I mean to be," most people believed it without asking why. The operative near the service corridor saw him coming and did nothing. That was good. It meant Logan wasn't flagged yet, wasn't a variable they'd accounted for. He stopped at the service station, picked up a linen napkin from the stack there, and used it as a reason to stand with his back partially to the room. From this angle, he could see the door to the utility corridor. It was unlocked. The handle sat at a slight angle, the latch not quite seated. The kind of thing that happened when you propped a door and let it drift back without securing it. Someone had been through there recently. Someone who didn't want to be heard using a key. He gave it 2 minutes. He watched the operative near the corridor without appearing to watch him, tracking the man's attention, waiting for the moment it shifted. It shifted when a tray of champagne glasses hit the floor on the far side of the room. Not loud, but enough of a social disruption that every head in the ballroom turned by instinct, including the operatives. Logan went through the door. The utility corridor was narrow and badly lit, a single row of fluorescents running the length of the ceiling, the kind of institutional lighting that made everything look slightly jaundiced. It smelled like cleaning solution, an old carpet, and the specific metallic smell of HVAC equipment working harder than it wanted to. The corridor ran parallel to the ballroom wall for about 40 feet before it branched, left toward the loading dock, right toward what looked like a mechanical room. He moved right. The signal jammer was in the third door on the right side of the corridor. He knew it before he opened the door because he could feel it, not the signal loss itself that was just absence, but the particular quality of silence that electronic interference produced in an enclosed space, a kind of pressure in the air that he associated with certain forward operating bases where the enemy ran jamming equipment to disrupt drone comms. He'd felt it enough times that his body had cataloged it somewhere below conscious thought. He opened the door. The room was roughly 8 by 10, packed with junction boxes and conduit runs, and a bank of circuit breakers that served some section of the hotel. And on the floor beside the breaker panel, plugged into a commercial power strip and zip-tied to the base of a conduit rack, was the jammer. It was a professional piece of equipment, not something you ordered off the internet. Black casing, 2 antenna arrays, a status light blinking green at steady intervals. Someone had spent real money on it. Someone had brought it in before tonight, during setup, during one of the 60-odd opportunities that a hotel gala provided for things to move in and out without detailed scrutiny. Logan crouched next to it. He didn't touch it yet. The zip ties were fresh, white, not yellowed, probably placed within the last 6 hours to secure the unit against someone accidentally kicking it loose. The power strip had a physical on-off switch. Simple enough. But killing it now, before Callahan was in position, before Logan had any sense of what was happening at the exits, would alert the 7 men in the ballroom that something had shifted. They had to assume the operatives were monitoring signal restoration on their own comms. The moment the jammer went down, the operation would accelerate. He needed more information before he pulled that switch. He backed out of the room, left the door exactly as he'd found it, and moved down the corridor toward the loading dock branch. What he found at the loading dock was worse than he'd expected, and also, in a practical sense, clarifying. There were 3 men outside the dock doors. He could see them through the narrow window set into the door at roughly eye level. A reinforced square of wire mesh glass, scratched and smudged, giving him a distorted view of the dock area and the 2 vehicles parked there. A black cargo van, engine idling, the exhaust faint in the cold air. A dark SUV with tinted windows, parked at an angle that would allow it to move quickly without having to turn around. 3 men, armed. He could see the silhouettes clearly enough in the dock lighting, the distinctive bulk at the hip on 2 of them. The third was something slung across his back that was probably a short-barrel rifle under a jacket that was cut to conceal it imperfectly. They were not hotel staff. They were not event security. They were drivers and escorts, and they were already in position, which meant the timeline was shorter than Logan had hoped. He stood at the door for 12 seconds, counting and mapping, then moved back toward the ballroom. He found Callahan exactly where he'd left him. Same table, same drink, but now with a different quality of stillness. The stillness of a man who had made a decision and was waiting for his moment. Logan passed the table without stopping, dropped a cocktail napkin as he walked past, and kept moving. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. Callahan looked at the napkin for a moment, then folded it once and set it beside his glass, which was the agreed signal for, "I understand, I'm ready." They hadn't actually agreed on that signal. Logan had invented it on the spot and trusted that a man who'd spent 30-some years in intelligence work would parse it correctly. He had. Logan worked his way back to Victoria. She was at the podium. The Foundation's executive director had handed her the microphone for what was supposed to be a brief thank you to the evening's major donors, but which Victoria was extending with the specific skill of someone who understood that attention was a resource and she was currently the only one in the room who could direct it. She wasn't rambling. She was methodical about it, moving through names, pausing for appropriate moments, keeping the audience's faces turned toward the stage. Every second she held that microphone was a second the room wasn't watching the exits. Logan positioned himself along the east wall where she could see him when she looked up from her notes. She looked up 3 times in the first 2 minutes. On the 3rd time, he held up 2 fingers, pointed toward the north wall, and then held up 7 fingers with his other hand, pointed toward the stage-left curtain. She absorbed this without any change in expression, nodded once in the almost imperceptible way people nodded when they were listening to a speech, and finding it meaningful and kept talking. 7 men. 2 vehicles at the loading dock. Jammer located but not disabled. She had understood all of it in the time it took her to acknowledge a donor's name. Logan exhaled slowly. He'd worked with trained operators who communicated less efficiently. The problem Logan was turning over in his head as he moved back toward the utility corridor had several layers, and he wasn't satisfied with any of them. The operation was professional. That was the first layer, and it mattered because professional operations had contingencies. If one exit was blocked, they'd use another. If the jammer was disabled, they'd either accelerate the timeline or abort. Aborting was actually the best possible outcome. 7 armed men walking away from a ballroom full of witnesses was something the legal system could address. An accelerated timeline, on the other hand, meant 300 people being moved at gunpoint in whatever direction the operatives decided, and that was a situation where variables multiplied fast and outcomes became unpredictable. He needed to neutralize the exits before the jammer came down, not after. The sequence mattered, but he was one man, unarmed, in a tuxedo that didn't fit, in a hotel he'd been inside for 2.5 hours. He stopped in the corridor and stood there for a moment, doing the kind of arithmetic that didn't involve numbers. The east exit operative was the one he was least sure about. The man was big, not as tall as Logan, but wider, the kind of physical build that came from years of deliberate cultivation. And he was standing with the grounded patience of someone who knew how to use it. The man near the stage left curtain was smaller but had the awareness of someone accustomed to working in crowded spaces. The service corridor operative was the one who had clocked Logan briefly when he'd passed earlier. A moment of eye contact, a reading, a conclusion that had apparently come out neutral. That was the one who might be a problem. Logan needed something. Not a weapon, necessarily. A weapon created its own set of complications in an enclosed space with 300 civilians, but something that shifted the balance of the room before the thing started. He found it in the linen closet at the end of the utility corridor. The linen closet also contained, somewhat inexplicably, the hotel's fire suppression system panel for this wing. Logan stared at it for a moment. It was a gray metal box mounted to the wall at chest height, panel doors slightly ajar, the kind of maintenance access that hotel engineers checked periodically and frequently forgot to fully close. Inside were the zone controls for the ballroom sprinkler system. He did not pull the fire alarm. Pulling the alarm would create the precise kind of chaos the operatives could exploit. Panicked guests moving in unpredictable directions, exits suddenly full of people, emergency personnel responding to a situation they weren't briefed on. That was worse, not better. But the panel also showed him something useful, the emergency lighting schematic for this section of the hotel. The ballroom had 2 lighting systems, the primary decorative system controlled by the main board near the stage, and an emergency backup system hardwired to the building's power grid. The backup system, by code, would engage if primary power was cut. What the schematic also showed him, in a small notation that was probably only interesting to electrical engineers and people doing tactical assessments of hotel ballrooms, was that the primary system's main breaker for this wing was in the mechanical room he'd already visited, the same room as the jammer. He stood very still for a moment, working through it. If he killed the primary lighting, the ballroom would drop to emergency lighting, low, red-tinged, disorienting for anyone who wasn't expecting it. It would also, for approximately 4 to 6 seconds, completely alter every sightline in the room. The operatives would lose visual confirmation of their targets. Guests would instinctively crouch or move toward each other. Victoria would have cover, and Logan would know it was coming, which meant he could be positioned before it happened. It was not a clean plan. It had significant downsides. It also might be the best option available to a man with no weapon, no backup, and a timeline he didn't control. He took a photograph of the schematic with his phone, which still had no signal, but the camera worked fine, and walked back toward the ballroom. He needed to tell Callahan, and he needed to tell Victoria. Getting to Callahan first was easier. Logan took a route through the service corridor that brought him out near the dining tables on the west side of the room, moved along the perimeter, and arrived at Callahan's table from the opposite direction he'd come from before. He sat down without ceremony. The old man didn't look up immediately, just turned his wine glass once by the stem. "Loading dock," Logan said quietly. 3 men, 2 vehicles. They're not waiting. They're staged. "How long do you think we have?" Callahan asked. "My best estimate is the keynote runs another 30 minutes at most. When it ends and the room starts to break up, they move. They want the confusion of the crowd ending, not the concentration of it." Callahan nodded. "So we have 30 minutes. Less if something tips them." Logan put his phone on the table, angled so Callahan could see the photograph of the schematic without it being visible to anyone farther away. "Main breaker for the ballroom primary lighting is in the mechanical room, same room as the jammer." Callahan studied the photograph. His jaw moved slightly, the unconscious habit of someone working through a problem they didn't fully like. You want to kill the lights. 6 seconds of darkness, maybe 8, enough for me to close distance on the 2 nearest positions before they reestablish visuals. And if guests panic? Darkness in a fancy hotel is confusing, not inherently threatening. The instinct is to stop moving, not to run. If it holds at 6 seconds and comes back on, the room resets. If it goes longer, he paused. It won't go longer. Callahan looked at him. You'd need to cut the breaker and disable the jammer in the same action. The jammer's on a power strip. If I cut the breaker, the power strip loses power. The jammer goes down at the same moment the lights do. And your signal comes back in the dark. And I'm already calling 911 before I cut the breaker, one-touch dial, so the call is already connecting when the lights go down. Even if the line takes 40 seconds to pick up, we've got law enforcement on the way before the operatives know what changed. Callahan was quiet for a moment. Somewhere at the front of the room, Victoria was still talking, her voice carrying the specific warmth of someone who had decided that keeping 300 people calm was the most important job in the building, which it was. There's a problem, Callahan said. I know. You need to be in the mechanical room to cut the breaker and disable the jammer, which means you can't be in the ballroom when the lights go down. No. So who manages the 2 nearest positions in the first 6 seconds? Logan looked at him. How's your heart condition? Callahan made a sound that was almost a laugh. Manageable. The east exit operative is the bigger problem. The stage left position is closer to the south wall. If the lights go down and there's confusion, that one's going to move toward Victoria, not toward the exit. That's actually useful because it takes him away from the guests. The east exit operative is going to go for the door and try to signal his people outside. I can delay him, Callahan said. I'm not going to pretend I can do what you would do, but I can create an obstacle. I know how to fall convincingly. Logan absorbed this. A 67-year-old man with a heart condition was volunteering to physically intercept a trained operative by falling on him, which was insane, which was also the best available option. Don't get hurt, Logan said. I'll do my level best. Callahan straightened his blue tie with 2 fingers. What's the signal? Victoria, Logan said. Watch her at the podium. When she picks up her water glass and holds it for a count of 3, I'm already in the corridor. You move to the coat check. When the lights go down, that's when you do whatever you're going to do. Callahan nodded once. It was the nod of a man who had once coordinated considerably more complex operations than this one, in places considerably more dangerous than a hotel ballroom, and who found the nostalgia of it neither comfortable nor entirely unwelcome. Logan stood, picked up his phone, and went to find Victoria. Boshid. The foundation director was at the microphone now, running through what appeared to be a lengthy acknowledgement of the gala's planning committee. Victoria had stepped back from the podium to the edge of the stage area, and Logan timed his approach so that he arrived as a catering staff member was clearing the table nearest the stage, creating a brief cluster of movement that gave him a plausible reason to stop and stand without looking like he was waiting for her. She came to him, crossed the 3 feet of space without making it look like a crossing. Loading dock, he said. 3 men, 2 vehicles, already staged. We're looking at 30 minutes maximum before they move. Her face did something small and controlled. That's less time than I hoped. Yeah. He told her the rest of it. The lights, the breaker, the jammer, the sequence. He told her what he needed her to do, which was to move the guest toward the center of the room naturally, using the speech as cover, and to position herself near the head table where the 4 structural columns would give her the most cover if things went badly wrong. And the water glass signal, she said. When you're ready, when I give you a nod from the service door. She was quiet for a moment. Around them the ballroom hummed with the specific ambient noise of a large event. Silverware, low conversation, the director's voice rolling through the names of the planning committee. Normal. Completely normal to anyone looking at it from the outside. What if something goes wrong in the corridor, she asked. Then Callahan calls 911 anyway, and you do whatever you have to do to keep people away from the exits until police arrive. That's not what I meant, she said. He looked at her. Her expression was still composed, still professionally neutral, but her eyes were asking him something that she wasn't going to say out loud in the middle of a ballroom. He understood it anyway. She was asking what happened to him if something went wrong. I've been in worse rooms than this, he said, which was true. With a daughter at home, she said, which was also true. He didn't have a good answer for that. He'd been aware of Cora the entire time, not as a fear exactly, but as a presence, the way you were always aware of North when you were navigating. She was the fixed point. She was the thing he came home to, and she was also the reason he didn't walk away from things that needed doing, because she was going to grow up watching how he lived his life, and he had very specific ideas about what he wanted her to see. I have a daughter at home, he said. That's exactly why I'm not walking out that door. Victoria held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the same barely there nod she'd used before, efficient and honest. When you're ready, she said. He left her at the edge of the stage and walked toward the service door. Boop. The mechanical room was exactly as he'd left it. Door slightly ajar, fluorescence buzzing, the jammer's green light still blinking its steady, indifferent rhythm. Logan pulled the door fully closed behind him, which would give him an additional 3 seconds if anyone came down the corridor. He moved to his phone and dialed 911, one touch, held the call connecting in his left hand, and then crouched in front of the breaker panel. The main breaker for ballroom primary lighting was labeled in the precise, faded typeface of a panel that hadn't been updated since the hotel's last major renovation, which Logan estimated at roughly 15 years ago based on the style. He found it in 11 seconds, confirmed it against the schematic photograph, identified the physical breaker position. The 911 operator picked up. 911. What's your emergency? Armed individuals staging a kidnapping at the Meridian Grand Hotel, ballroom level, Logan said, his voice low and completely even. 7 operatives inside the ballroom, 3 more at the loading dock with 2 vehicles. The target is Victoria Hawthorne. I need police, and I need them at the Meridian Grand loading dock and all ballroom exits. Do not use the main hotel entrance. That entrance is monitored by the operatives. A brief pause. Sir, can you... I'm a former Navy SEAL. The situation is active. I need units now. He gave the hotel address, the dock entrance location, the specific ballroom level. He stayed on the line for 45 seconds, answering the follow-up questions quickly and precisely, and then he said, I have to go silent. Units are on the way. Do not break radio silence until you have visual on the dock vehicles. He didn't wait for a response. He set the phone on top of the breaker panel with the call still live and open. Somewhere in a dispatch center on the other side of the city, someone was now logging this as a potential armed incident at a downtown hotel, which meant a supervisor was being alerted, which meant the response would be more substantial than a standard welfare check. Probably 6 to 8 minutes until the first unit, possibly less, depending on patrol positions. 6 to 8 minutes. He looked at the jammer's green light one more time, reached to his left, found the physical on/off switch on the power strip, confirmed the position with his fingers without depressing it. His right hand found the main breaker. He breathed in once, slow. From across the ballroom, Victoria had been watching the service door with the peripheral attention of someone managing a dozen things at once, which she was. She was listening to the foundation director's closing remarks. She was tracking the positions of the 7 operatives without appearing to track anything at all. She was thinking about the guests, which tables were nearest the exits and therefore most exposed, which guests she knew well enough to trust with a quiet instruction if she needed to give one, which of the waitstaff might be actual hotel employees versus someone who wasn't supposed to be carrying a serving tray. She was also thinking, against her will and with a kind of irritated resignation, about Logan Pierce. He was not what she'd expected when she'd crossed the room toward him. She hadn't expected anything in particular. She'd expected competence, because the alternative was useless, and she'd expected some measure of fear, because fear was reasonable. She hadn't expected someone who laid out a tactical situation with the same calm specificity that she laid out a quarterly earnings call. She hadn't expected the thing he'd said about his daughter, or the way he'd said it, not as an explanation or a justification, just as a fact about who he was. She pushed this aside. She was very good at pushing things aside. The service door moved. She caught it in her periphery. A 3-inch gap opening and then holding, a face she recognized appearing in it, looking for her. She found him in the gap and held eye contact for exactly half a second, which was enough. She reached for her water glass, lifted it, held it. 1, 2, 3. She set it down and waited. The lights went out. Not gradually, not the slow dimming of a system powering down, but the sudden absolute darkness of a primary circuit failing, the kind of darkness that hit the visual cortex like a physical impact and produced, in the space of about 1 second, a complete neurological reset. 500 people stopped moving. The music stopped. The director's voice stopped. There was a single sharp intake of breath from somewhere near the stage, and then the 2 or 3 seconds of stunned collective silence that preceded the noise. Then the noise came. Voices, overlapping. What happened? Is everything okay? Did someone... And then the scrape of chairs and the rustle of evening wear as people instinctively moved closer to the people next to them. Not panic, not yet. The confused social anxiety of a large group of people in unexpected darkness, which was disorienting and frightening, and also, critically, not violent. The emergency lighting came on at 3 seconds, red-tinged, low, running along the baseboard of the ballroom walls, giving the room the specific quality of a theater between acts. Enough to see shapes, not enough to see faces. Victoria was already moving. She stepped onto the low stage platform. 1 step, she knew exactly where it was, and picked up the microphone from the stand beside the podium. She kept her voice at the exact pitch and warmth of someone who had everything under control, because the voice was the thing that rooms listened to in the dark. "Everyone, please stay where you are," she said clearly. "The hotel is handling a temporary power issue. Please remain with your table, keep your phones out if you need light, and stay calm. This will be resolved very shortly." 300 people who had just applauded her for $22 million heard the same voice that had delivered that number, and instinctively, in the way that crowds responded to the authority they'd most recently confirmed, they listened. The room settled. Not completely, not without murmuring and the continued scrape of concerned movement, but it held. Across the room, at the east exit, Arthur Callahan had stood from his table. The operative at the east exit was already moving when the lights dropped, not toward the door, as Logan had predicted, but toward the stage, which meant he'd made a decision in the first second of darkness about where the primary target was. That was a mistake. And it was the kind of mistake that happened when an operation shifted into its active phase and individuals defaulted to the objective rather than the plan. Callahan stepped into his path. He didn't fake the fall particularly well because it was genuinely difficult to fall convincingly in a crowded room in emergency lighting. But he didn't need to fall well. He just needed to fall. He went down sideways, chair catching the operative's left knee, Callahan's considerable weight landing against the man's lower body with the kind of stumbling, sprawling impact that was hard to read as anything other than an elderly man losing his footing in the chaos. The operative went down. Not hard, he was trained enough to catch himself, but the 2 seconds of untangling that followed, the awkward physical negotiation of an old man clutching at him in apparent confusion, saying, I'm sorry, I tripped," in the specific, terrified voice of a civilian who'd just lost his footing in a dark room, bought exactly the time it was designed to buy. 2 seconds, 3, and then the lights came back on. Logan hit the main breaker back up from inside the corridor. He'd timed it from the moment the lights dropped, counting in his head the way he'd learned to count in dark water, in tight spaces, in the particular silence of an operation that was moving whether you were ready or not. He'd killed the lights, killed the jammer, opened the 911 call, and re-engaged the breaker in a window of just over 5 seconds. The signal was back. His phone was already ringing. Not the 911 call, which was still live and open on top of the panel, but his own phone buzzing in his pocket with the specific vibration pattern of a number he didn't recognize. He ignored it. He could hear, faintly through the utility corridor wall, the noise of the ballroom reassembling itself. Victoria's voice cutting through it with the clean authority of someone who had decided that the room was hers. He stepped back into the corridor and moved fast toward the ballroom door. The operative he was most worried about, the one near the stage-left curtain, the one he'd assessed as having the spatial awareness of someone trained for crowds, was going to understand, in approximately the next 60 seconds, that the jammer was down. Not because he had any way of knowing what had happened in the mechanical room, but because his comms would come back online, because his people outside would start trying to reach him, and because a professional doing a tactical assessment would identify the signal restoration as a deliberate act rather than a technical failure. When that operative understood what had happened, the operation would either abort or accelerate. Logan pushed through the ballroom door and scanned the room in the 2 seconds of full primary lighting before anything else changed. He found the stage-left operative, found him in the act of touching his ear, fingers pressing against the comms unit, head tilting with the particular concentration of someone receiving information he hadn't expected. Their eyes met across the length of the ballroom, and Logan watched the moment the man understood. The operative's hand dropped from his ear, his weight shifted forward, heels coming up slightly off the floor, and for one still second the two of them stood in the middle of a ballroom full of people who had no idea what was about to happen, measuring each other across 50 feet of Italian marble and crystal chandelier light. Then the operative moved, and Logan moved, and the night, which had been building toward this moment since the first whispered "help me" at the edge of the dance floor, finally broke open. The distance between them was 52 feet. Logan counted it in the first half second of movement, the way distance became automatic when you'd spent years thinking in terms of angles and coverage and the specific geometry of a threat. The operative was fast, faster than his build suggested, with the economical acceleration of someone who didn't waste motion, and he was cutting a diagonal line toward the stage, which told Logan two things simultaneously. This man's primary objective was still Victoria, and he'd been given permission to stop being subtle. The operation had shifted from patience to force. Logan closed the distance at an angle that intercepted the operative's path without going straight at him, because straight-line charges in crowded spaces created collateral problems. He cut between two tables, shouldered past a man in a gray suit who said, "Hey," and didn't finish the word, and hit the operative from the left side at roughly the 30-foot mark. It was not a clean tackle. There was nothing clean about it. They went into a table, the table went sideways, glassware came down in a cascade of sound that was shockingly loud in a room that had been in the process of settling. Someone screamed. Several people pushed their chairs back. Logan got his left forearm across the operative's throat and his right hand on the man's wrist before the gun cleared its holster, and for 3 seconds they were locked in the specific ugly stillness of two people who both knew what they were doing and were discovering that the other one did too. The operative was strong, trained. He used the table's edge as a lever and rotated his body in a way that broke Logan's throat grip and created enough space to get an elbow into Logan's ribs. The pain was sharp and immediate, and Logan filed it somewhere behind the part of his brain that was still working the problem. He dropped his weight, took the elbow, used the momentum to drag the operative's arm down and across his own body, and put the man on the floor. It took another 4 seconds to pin the weapon hand and another 2 to get the gun clear and slide it under the nearest table where it was out of reach for both of them. By the time it was done, Logan's right knee was on the operative's upper back, and the man was face down on the Meridian Grand's Italian marble, breathing hard, not moving. 6 or 7 guests within immediate radius were standing frozen, staring. "Police are on the way," Logan said, loudly enough to carry. "Everyone, please move toward the center of the room, away from the exits, now." He didn't look up to see if they listened. He was already looking for the next problem. The next problem was at the east exit. Callahan's intervention had bought time, but not resolution. The operative he'd tripped had untangled himself and was back on his feet, and he was no longer trying to be subtle either. He had his hand inside his jacket, and he was scanning the room with the particular sharp attention of someone recalibrating after a plan that had started coming apart at the edges. He hadn't drawn yet. There were too many witnesses, too many phones now out and recording, too many faces turned toward the east side of the room. Callahan was back in his chair. He was breathing harder than Logan would have liked to see from across a ballroom, his color not quite right, but he was upright, and he caught Logan's eye and gave a small, deliberate nod that communicated roughly, "I'm fine, handle it." Logan was already moving. The east exit operative made him from 20 feet out and made a decision. Not the stage, not Victoria, but the exit itself. He turned, pushed through the door, and was gone into the hotel corridor beyond. Logan went through the door, 12 seconds behind him. What? The corridor outside the ballroom's east exit ran the length of the hotel's function floor, a wide, carpeted hallway lined with framed photographs of the city's history, bright overhead lighting, the kind of corridor that connected ballrooms to restrooms to the elevator bank. At this hour, it was mostly empty. Just 2 hotel employees near the far elevator who turned to look as the exit door banged open. The operative was 30 feet ahead and running, which told Logan the calculation had changed for him too. This man wasn't abandoning the operation so much as repositioning. He was headed for the elevator bank, and beyond the elevator bank was the stairwell, and the stairwell would take him to the loading dock. He was going to signal the dock team directly. Logan ran. He was faster than the operative over open ground, longer stride, better lung capacity, and something that wasn't quite anger but functioned similarly, and the gap closed to 15 feet before they reached the elevator bank. One of the hotel employees said something alarmed and unintelligible. Logan registered it and didn't stop. The operative hit the stairwell door with his shoulder and went through. Logan caught the door on the rebound, which saved him 2 seconds, and went through behind him. The stairwell was concrete and echo, the sound of footsteps multiplying off the walls in a way that made it hard to locate precisely where the other person was. Logan went down. The loading dock was 2 floors below, taking the stairs in long, efficient steps, one hand on the rail for the turns, the other hand free. He could hear the operative below him, close, maybe half a flight. He caught him on the landing between floors. The operative had stopped, turned, was waiting, which was smart, because the stairwell was a choke point and going in first was a disadvantage. Logan saw the shift in weight that preceded a strike and adjusted his approach angle, came in lower than expected, and what followed was 30 seconds of the kind of close-quarters fighting that was less cinematic than people imagined and considerably more painful, mostly because concrete floors and metal railings were involved and neither man was trying to be graceful. Logan took a hit to the side of his head that made the stairwell go briefly bright. He gave back a knee to the operative's midsection that produced a satisfying and informative sound, which told him the man's core conditioning was good but not exceptional. They separated for half a second, both of them against opposite walls of the landing, both of them breathing hard. And in that half second, Logan saw the operative look at the door to his left, the floor-level exit, and make the decision. He went through the door. Logan followed. They came out into a hotel service corridor, narrow, fluorescent, identical to the one he'd navigated earlier but on a different floor, and the operative ran left, which was the wrong direction. Logan knew it was wrong because he'd looked at the building layout long enough to have a working map of it, and left led to the hotel laundry facility, not the dock. The man was turned around. Logan stopped running. He stood in the corridor and breathed, working through his options. Chasing the operative into a dead-end laundry facility had its own set of problems. He was one man. He also needed to know what was happening in the ballroom. He pulled out his phone. He had signal. Beautiful, complete, unambiguous signal, every bar lit up, and there was a missed call from the 911 dispatch, and 3 from a number he didn't recognize that turned out, when he called it back, to be Callahan. "Law enforcement is 2 minutes out," Callahan said when he picked up. He was still breathing harder than ideal, but his voice was steady. "I've been on with dispatch since the lights came back on. They have the dock location." "How's the room?" "Ms. Hawthorne has it. I don't know how, but she has it." A brief pause. "There was a scuffle near the stage. You?" "Handled. Where are the others?" 2 moved toward the main entrance when the lights went down and didn't come back in. 1 near the coat check moved for the utility corridor about 4 minutes ago, came back out, and is now standing near the north wall, looking like a man reconsidering his life choices. Another pause, shorter. "The one in the sound booth hasn't moved." Logan absorbed this. 2 gone. 1 neutralized on the floor of the ballroom. 1 loose in the laundry corridor behind him. 1 near the north wall. 1 at the sound booth. And Victoria still in the ballroom with 2 operatives in proximity who hadn't yet committed to action. "The sound booth," he said. "Does it have a direct sight line to the stage?" A pause that was Callahan checking. "Yes." Get Ms. Hawthorne off the stage. He was already moving back toward the stairwell. Victoria had not left the stage because leaving the stage meant the room lost its anchor, and the room could not lose its anchor. She understood this with the same clarity that she understood balance sheets, not emotionally, just practically, as a matter of consequence. 300 people in a large room with limited information and elevated adrenaline were one wrong move away from becoming 300 people doing things that would make the operative team's job considerably easier. Crowd behavior was not rational behavior. It was aggregate behavior, which was different, and it responded to signal. She was the signal. So she stayed at the microphone and she talked, because talking was what she had, and she was better at it than most people alive. She kept her voice at the specific register of, I have information, everything is under control, you are safe if you listen to me. Not cheerful, because cheerful would have been false, and people felt false, but calm and factual and present. She'd moved through the immediate aftermath of the scuffle near the stage by identifying it clearly, before speculation could fill the silence. There's been an altercation involving security personnel, she said, 3 seconds after Logan and the operative hit the table. It is being handled. Please remain seated and away from the exits. Hotel security and police have been notified. Both of those things were true. The first because she'd watched it happen, the second because she was choosing to believe Logan had done what he said he would do. She kept talking. She moved from the incident to the Foundation's history, because history gave people something to hold on to, and because the parents in this room, and there were many of them, this was a children's charity event, responded to narrative about children with a particular quality of attention. She talked about the reading program. She talked about a girl named Maya who had come into the program 2 years ago unable to read chapter books and had last month finished her 3rd one of the year. She didn't say the girl's last name because that would have been inappropriate, but she said her first name because the first name made her real. The room was listening. She noticed the operative near the north wall at her peripheral left. He hadn't moved in 3 minutes. He was watching her, but not moving, and she had spent enough time in rooms full of people evaluating her to know the difference between someone who was about to act and someone who was waiting for instruction that wasn't coming. His body language had shifted from predatory to uncertain, which meant his comms were back and what he was hearing through them was not good news. The sound booth was a different problem. She hadn't looked at it directly. Looking at it directly would have been a signal, and she was being very careful about signals. But she knew it was there, a glass-fronted booth at the rear elevation of the ballroom, elevated about 8 feet above the floor, accessible by a single interior staircase near the north wall. She'd been inside it twice during setup to check the AV configuration for the speech. She knew the sight lines from it were nearly perfect. She also knew, without having been told, that Logan needed her off the stage. It was the logical assessment. The sound booth had a clear line to her, and if there was a man in the sound booth who had been watching her for 3 hours and whose plan was now actively coming apart, the stage was the worst place she could be standing. She needed a reason to step off. She made one. I'd like to bring someone up to close the evening, she said into the microphone. Someone who has been part of this foundation for 6 years and whose contribution to the reading program has been both quiet and immeasurable. Arthur Callahan. Would you come up here? It was completely improvised. She'd said Callahan's name because it was the only name available to her, because she'd seen him near the east wall and knew he was functional, and because getting Callahan to the stage gave her a reason to step away from the microphone to escort him. The room, which had been holding itself together through the specific social glue of following the woman who seemed to know what was happening, responded with the reflex of applause. Not enthusiastic, uncertain, but genuine enough. Callahan, to his considerable credit, stood up. He moved toward the stage with the careful dignity of a man who had been asked to speak at charity events before, and found them mildly tedious but accepted them as part of the social contract. Logan had asked him not to get hurt. Victoria had just asked him to walk across a ballroom toward a stage under a sound booth containing a potentially hostile operative. He made the walk anyway, because the alternative was worse, and because he trusted that if Logan was still operational, the sound booth problem was being addressed. He was right. Done. Logan came up the interior staircase of the sound booth from below. The staircase was accessed through a door off the north wall service corridor. a door he'd noted earlier and not thought much about until Callahan's information about the sound booth changed its relevance entirely. He'd taken it at speed, which was not ideal in a narrow staircase, but speed was what he had, and the sound of his own footfalls on the stairs was covered by the ambient noise of the ballroom below. The sound booth door was at the top of the stairs. It was not locked, which was hotel policy for safety reasons and which Logan appreciated on a professional level. He pushed it open slowly, not slowly enough to be cautious, but slowly enough that the operative inside, who was facing the glass window watching the ballroom floor, didn't register the door movement in his peripheral vision before Logan was already inside the room. The booth was small, 8 feet deep, 12 feet wide, crammed with the equipment of a professional AV setup: mixing board, monitor screens, a rack of signal processors, 2 chairs. The operative was in the left chair, leaning forward with both forearms on the edge of the mixing board, watching through the glass with the fixed attention of someone monitoring a developing situation. He had a radio handset in his right hand, not quite pressed to his ear, waiting. He heard Logan take the second step into the room and turned. He was younger than the others, maybe 28, 29, with the specific brand of focused calm that came from training rather than experience. And Logan could see in his face the moment the assessment happened. Registered threat, registered size, registered the absence of a weapon in Logan's hand, and calculated whether that was reassuring or suspicious. And the calculation took too long because the situation was not one his training had prepared him for. Most people who came through that door were supposed to be AV technicians. Logan crossed the room in 2 steps, and the fight in the sound booth was shorter and considerably less even than the one in the stairwell, because the space allowed for almost no movement, and the operative's decision to reach for his radio rather than his weapon was a choice that Logan had been anticipating and had already planned around. He got the radio first, then the weapon hand, and the sequence after that was efficient and not graceful, and left the operative seated in the right chair with both hands secured behind him, using a cable tie that Logan had found, with the practical foresight of a man who had been thinking about contingencies for the past 2 hours, in a supply drawer beneath the mixing board. The operative looked up at him from the chair. He was unhurt, mostly, except for a developing bruise on his jawline that Logan felt some mild professional regret about. "Police are going to be here in about 90 seconds, Logan said. "Sit still." The operative said nothing. Logan looked through the sound booth glass at the ballroom below. He could see Callahan moving toward the stage, the room's faces turned toward him. He could see Victoria stepping away from the microphone, moving toward the edge of the stage platform with the composed unhurry of someone performing a gracious handoff. He could see the North Wall operative still standing near the service station, his posture now fully defensive rather than operational. Weight back, not forward, the body language of a man who was not going to be the last one standing if he had a choice about it. He could see, in the far upper corner of the ballroom monitor screen, a wide-angle camera feed that was part of the AV system's setup, the first flash of red and blue light coming through the ballroom's tall north windows, reflecting off the glass and the chandeliers in small spinning arcs of color. The police were at the dock. The sound of sirens, even muffled by the hotel's walls, produced a visible change in the ballroom. Guests heard it first as a texture rather than a sound, a vibration, a shift in the ambient noise that filtered through the ballroom walls in a way the band's music hadn't prepared them for. And then several people near the north windows saw the light, and the information moved through the crowd the way information always moved through crowds, faster and more distorting with each transmission. Victoria heard the specific change in the room's murmur, lower, more concentrated, the sound of people processing, and stepped back to the microphone. "Law enforcement has arrived at the hotel," she said. "Please remain where you are. Do not move toward the exits. Officers will be with us shortly." She said it the way she said everything tonight, evenly, factually, without the tremor that she could feel building somewhere behind her sternum because the adrenaline of the past 40 minutes had been doing things to her nervous system that would probably not fully manifest until she was somewhere private. Callahan had reached the stage. He stood next to her, slightly out of breath, and said quietly, "The North Wall operative is moving toward the service corridor." Victoria looked. He was right. The man was moving, not fast enough to draw immediate attention, but decisively, angled toward the service station, and the corridor beyond it. "He's going to run," she said. "Yes," Callahan agreed. "Let him." She turned to look at him. The old man's color was better now than it had been when he'd crossed the room, or perhaps the low lighting had been making it look worse than it was. His expression was the expression of someone who had made a calculation. "If he runs," he said, "he is no longer in this room, and the people who are paid to handle the running part are already in the building." Victoria held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded and turned back to the microphone, and she let the man run, and she spoke to the room, and the room held. Tétés. The loading dock situation resolved in the way that these situations resolved when law enforcement arrived in sufficient numbers and the party on the other side lacked both the exit routes and the motivation to escalate, which was to say, with a great deal of noise and then a sudden absence of noise, the specific auditory signature of a confrontation that has ended in compliance rather than violence. Logan heard it from the sound booth. He stayed where he was, one hand resting on the back of the operative's chair, watching the ballroom through the glass and listening to the radio traffic that he could now hear coming through the captured handset. The traffic was fragmentary, cut signals, clipped transmissions, people speaking in short-coded phrases that meant nothing to an outside listener except in aggregate. And what it told him in aggregate was that the dock team had been contained, that two of the ballroom operatives who had gone through the main entrance were being pursued in the hotel corridor, and that the remaining operational personnel had been given an abort signal from somewhere in the chain. The chain was fracturing. He waited another 4 minutes in the sound booth, watching the ballroom below become the new thing it was becoming, which was a scene with all the organized chaos that implied, uniformed officers coming through the service corridors and the main entrance, hotel management visible now after a notable absence, guests standing and talking and recording and being instructed to remain calm by people whose job it was to instruct them to remain calm. He watched Callahan shake hands with a plainclothes detective who had arrived at the stage. He watched Victoria talk to two officers simultaneously, her posture completely different now. Not performance, not composure, just the direct forward posture of someone giving information efficiently because the moment for managing appearances had passed. She was pointing toward the service corridor, toward the north wall, toward the exit where the operative had gone. She was telling them everything she knew, in the order she knew it, with the same precision she'd used when she told Logan. He looked at the operative in the chair. "What's your name?" The operative looked at him for a moment. "Marcus," he said. It might have been true. "Who hired your team, Marcus?" Marcus looked at the ceiling. He had the expression of someone doing a very rapid cost-benefit calculation. "I want a lawyer," he said. "Fair enough," Logan said. He wasn't a cop. He didn't need the information tonight. He left Marcus in the chair. He was secured, he was going nowhere, and went down the interior staircase, through the service corridor door, and back into the ballroom. The room was still loud and not yet under control in the orderly sense, but it was a different kind of loud now. The loud of 300 people discovering that something that might have been terrible hadn't been. The loud of shock becoming relief, becoming the urgent social need to process and share and confirm with the person next to you that, yes, this was real. Yes, it happened. Yes, they were all right. Logan moved through it quietly. He was looking for Callahan because Callahan's color had concerned him, and because 67 years old with a cardiac condition was not the profile of a man who should go unchecked after the last 40 minutes. He found him sitting in a chair that a young woman in a blue evening gown had apparently provided. She was crouched next to him with her hand on his arm, and Callahan was speaking to her with the patient attention of a man who was not having a cardiac event, but recognized that the young woman was worried about him and felt it was polite to address this. Logan stood nearby until Callahan looked up and caught his eye. "I'm fine," Callahan said, with the tone of a man who had said this at least twice already. "Your color is off," Logan said. "My color has been off since 2019. It's a condition, not a symptom." He studied Logan. "You're bleeding." Logan touched his temple where the stairwell hit had landed. His fingers came away with a moderate amount of blood, which explained why the young woman in blue was now looking at him with the same alarm she'd been directing at Callahan. He hadn't noticed the cut. He noticed things like exits and operative positions with automatic precision, but apparently his own head wound had not made it onto the priority list. "I'll get that looked at," he said. "You should do that before you do anything else," Callahan said. Logan looked around the room. He was looking for Victoria, which he was aware of doing and chose not to examine too closely. He spotted her near the main entrance, still talking to the plainclothes detective, her posture tightly controlled in the way of someone running on adrenaline and holding it together through will, because will was the tool available. She looked up at that moment and found him across the room. He couldn't read her expression at that distance. The room was too full, the lighting still slightly off from the emergency system cycling back to normal. But something in her face changed, and she said something to the detective, and the detective nodded, and she walked toward him. She stopped in front of him and looked at the cut on his temple for a moment before looking at his face. "How bad?" she asked. "Not bad." "You're bleeding on your collar." "It's a rental," he said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more like the thing that happened to a laugh when the person wasn't entirely sure they were allowed to have one yet. Then it subsided, and she looked at him with the directness she'd had from the first moment she'd come across that ballroom and said, "Help me," without preamble, without pretense. "Is it over?" she asked. Logan thought about the North Wall operative who had run for the service corridor, about Marcus secured in the sound booth, about the dock team in police custody, the pursuit in the hotel corridor, the two who'd gone through the main entrance. He thought about the chain that had fractured and the organization behind it, which would not be fully understood tonight and might not be fully understood for weeks. "Tonight is over," he said. She absorbed this. "That's an honest answer." "Yeah." She looked at him for another moment with something that was hard to name and that he didn't try to name. Then she turned toward the young woman in blue, who was still hovering near Callahan, and said, "Can you ask one of the hotel staff to bring a first aid kit here? Tell them it's for the gentleman with the cut on his head." "I can get it myself," Logan said. "I know you can," Victoria said. "Let someone help you for 10 seconds. He didn't have a good argument against that, so he stopped making one. Somewhere outside the ballroom, through the wall, through the corridor, through the loading dock and the concrete and the cold night air of the city, sirens were still going. Not arriving anymore, but present, the sustained sound of a scene being secured. Logan stood on the Italian marble floor in a tuxedo that had gotten considerably worse since the evening began, with blood on his collar and a cut on his temple, and at least one cracked rib that he was going to be very aware of tomorrow morning, and he thought about Cora. Cora, who was at home with Dale's wife, probably asleep by now, probably with some half-finished drawing on her nightstand because she never entirely finished them before she fell asleep. Cora, who would want pancakes in the morning and would show him the drawing and would not ask why his tuxedo looked like it had been in an altercation because she was 8 and she trusted that her father came home. He always came home. The young woman in blue returned with a first aid kit and a hotel medic and the organized briskness of someone who had found a task in a chaotic situation and was holding on to it with both hands. Logan sat where they pointed him, in a chair near the east wall, and let the medic press gauze against the cut on his temple, and he watched the room continue to become what it was becoming. Cora, who would want pancakes in the morning and would show him the drawing and would not ask why his tuxedo looked like it had been in an altercation because she was 8 and she trusted that her father came home. He always came home. The young woman in blue returned with a first aid kit and a hotel medic and the organized briskness of someone who had found a task in a chaotic situation and was holding on to it with both hands. Logan sat where they pointed him, in a chair near the east wall, and let the medic press gauze against the cut on his temple, and he watched the room continue to become what it was becoming. The aftermath, the processing, the slow exhale of 300 people who had been in danger without knowing it and were now safe. At the far end of the room, Callahan caught his eye and held up one hand, a small saluting gesture that wasn't quite a salute. Logan returned it. The medic said the cut would need 2 stitches, maybe 3. "That's manageable," Logan said. "You should go to the ER tonight." "I'll go," he said, and he meant it. He'd go, and then he'd go home, and tomorrow he'd have pancakes with Cora, and she'd show him the drawing, and he'd sit at the kitchen table in the particular morning light that came through their east-facing window, and the night would recede to where nights like this always receded. Not gone, not forgotten, but placed. Filed in the space where things that had been survived lived. He pressed the gauze against his head and watched a plainclothes detective put handcuffs on the north wall operative, who had apparently not made it as far through the service corridor as he'd hoped. Outside, the sirens finally began to quiet. The ER took 4 hours. Logan had known it would. He'd been to emergency rooms in 3 different countries under considerably worse circumstances than 2 stitches and a cracked rib. And the one thing they all had in common was that time moved differently inside them. Slower, more administrative, measured in waiting room chairs and clipboards, and the particular fluorescent patience of medical facilities at 2 in the morning. He sat in a curtained bay in St. Aurelius Medical Center and let a resident named Dr. Okafor, who looked approximately 26 years old and had the focused calm of someone running on their 19th consecutive hour of a shift, put 3 stitches in his temple with the neat efficiency of someone who did this 40 times a week. "You said you fell," Dr. Okafor said, without inflection, in the tone of someone who had heard this before. "I said I hit my head on a metal railing," Logan said. Which is accurate. Dr. Okafor looked at the bruising pattern on Logan's ribs, which he'd examined 15 minutes earlier, and then looked at Logan's hands, and then looked at his face. "The police officer in the waiting room asked about you." "I know. He said you don't have to talk to them tonight if you don't want to." "I'll talk to them," Logan said. "I just need 10 minutes first." Dr. Okafor finished the last stitch, tied it off, covered it with a small bandage, and stepped back. "The rib is the one that's going to bother you. Cracked, not broken, but you'll feel it for 4 to 6 weeks. No heavy lifting, no—" He paused, seeming to reconsider the standard advice in the context of what he was looking at. "Know whatever you were doing tonight. That was a one-time thing," Logan said. "Doctor." Okafor nodded with the polite skepticism of someone who'd heard that before too. He left, and Logan sat in the curtained bay for his 10 minutes, and he called Dale's wife, whose name was Renata, who picked up on the second ring despite the hour because he'd told her to expect a late call. "She's fine," Renata said immediately. "She's been asleep since 9:30. She made me read her 2 chapters of the book with the talking rabbits." "Watership Down?" "That's the one. Heavy reading for an 8-year-old. She likes heavy reading." He paused. "I'm going to be another hour, maybe 2. I'll come get her in the morning." "Logan," Renata's voice shifted. "I saw the news, the thing at the Meridian." He hadn't thought about the news. He probably should have. "I'm fine. 3 stitches. A silence. "Cora doesn't know?" "No. And I'd like to keep it that way until I can tell her myself, in the morning, in a way that doesn't scare her." "Of course." Another pause. "You did good tonight." "I did what was in front of me," he said, which was the only way he knew how to describe it. He hung up and sat for another minute in the curtained bay, listening to the hospital sounds around him. Monitors, voices, the distant percussion of a gurney moving fast down a corridor. Then he stood, tucked his ruined dress shirt back into the ruined tuxedo pants out of some residual sense of obligation to the garment, and went to find the police officer in the waiting room. The detective's name was Reyes. She was perhaps 40, with the compact physical economy of someone who had been in law enforcement long enough to stop wasting energy on things that didn't matter. And she had a small notebook that she'd been writing in for approximately 4 seconds before she put it away, apparently deciding that Logan was the kind of person you listened to rather than transcribed. They sat in the waiting room at 2:15 in the morning, the only people in a row of orange plastic chairs, and Logan told her what he knew in the order he knew it. He was thorough. He gave her the sequence of observations, the positions of the 7 operatives, the loading dock setup, the jammer, the timeline. He told her about Callahan's role and was careful to frame it in terms that reflected well on the old man, because Callahan had earned it. Reyes listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "We have 6 in custody," she said, 3 from the dock, 2 from the hotel corridor, and 1 from the ballroom. The North Wall operative ran into a patrol unit 2 blocks from the hotel. The one from the sound booth, she checked something on her phone, was collected by officers from the booth approximately 18 minutes after you left him there. "Marcus," Logan said. She looked at him. "That's the name he gave you?" "First name only." "Probably true. People usually give their real first name under stress, even when they're lying about everything else." Reyes absorbed this. the seventh man, the one from the stairwell. He went through a service-level door and was heading toward the laundry facility when I lost him. We found him, she said. He'd gone out a laundry loading access and made it 2 blocks before his own ankle gave out. Prior injury, apparently. She paused. He's talking. They're all talking to varying degrees, which is consistent with a hired operation rather than a committed one. Hired by who? Reyes looked at him with the expression of someone deciding how much to share. That's going to take time. What I can tell you is that the initial information suggests the financing came from corporate sources, and that at least 2 individuals with access to Ms. Hawthorne's security arrangements provided operational support to the team. Insiders. It was what Victoria had suspected from the first moment she'd started reading the room. How many? At least 2 confirmed, possibly 3. Ms. Hawthorne is being interviewed separately. Reyes closed her notebook fully and put it in her jacket pocket. Mr. Pierce, what you did tonight is going to require a formal statement, probably multiple interviews over the next week. You should know that. I know. You should also know. She paused, and for a moment the detective quality left her face and something more ordinary replaced it. There were a lot of people in that room tonight. Most of them went home to their families because of the decisions you and Mr. Callahan made. She stood. We'll be in touch. She left. Logan sat in the orange plastic chair for another moment, and then he went home. The week that followed had a quality that Logan associated with the period after any high-stress event. A kind of flatness, a decompression that was not quite peace and not quite exhaustion, but something in between. He went to school on Monday. He taught his first period history class, a group of 15-year-olds who were working through the First World War, and he sat on the edge of his desk and asked them to think about the decisions ordinary people made in extraordinary circumstances, and he meant it with a specificity that he did not share with them. Cora had taken the conversation about the gala with the particular gravity of an 8-year-old who understood that something serious had happened and was working hard to process it correctly. He'd sat with her at the kitchen table on Sunday morning with pancakes and the drawing she'd made the night before, a horse. She'd been in a horse phase for 3 months. And he'd told her that he'd been at an event where some men had tried to do something wrong, and that he'd helped stop it, and that he had a small cut on his head that was already healing. He'd shown her the bandage. She'd touched it very carefully with 2 fingers. Were you scared? She asked. He thought about the honest answer. A little, but being scared and doing the right thing aren't mutually exclusive. She'd thought about this for a moment, fork suspended over her pancakes. Ms. Del Rey says the reading program might get a lot more money now because of the lady at the party. That's possible, Logan said. Is that the lady you helped? Yeah. Cora had looked at him with the considering expression that she'd had since she was about 4 years old, the one that meant she was adding information to a picture she was building slowly and carefully, and would present conclusions about it at a time of her choosing. Then she'd picked up her fork and eaten her pancakes and asked if they could go to the park later, and Logan had said yes, and they'd gone. And he'd pushed her on the swings until his cracked rib reminded him that it was there, and she'd asked if his side hurt, and he'd said only a little, and she'd accepted this and jumped off the swing at the highest point of the arc the way she always did, which still took 10 years off his life every single time. The formal interviews with Detective Reyes and her colleagues took 4 sessions over 6 days. Logan gave them everything he had, which was substantial, and the investigators filled in the rest from the 6 men in custody and the financial trails that forensic accountants were following through the corporate structures behind the operation. It took 11 days for the full picture to emerge publicly, and when it did, it was worse than Logan had guessed and better than it could have been. The kidnapping had been financed by a consortium of 3 corporate entities with indirect connections to Vantage Group International, a private equity firm that stood to lose significant market position if Hawthorne Capital Group's pending merger with Nexion Partners closed. The merger would consolidate a controlling interest in a logistics sector that Vantage had spent 3 years positioning itself to dominate. The financial motive was straightforward, even if the methodology was not. They hadn't planned to kill Victoria Hawthorne. They'd planned to hold her long enough to coerce a signature, a withdrawal, a public statement that the merger terms were under review, the kind of leverage that looked like a decision from the outside. The insiders were the part that hit Victoria hardest. Logan heard about them not from the news, which covered it in the reductive language that financial crime required for general audiences, but from Victoria herself, who called him on the 9th day after the gala and asked if he had time to talk. He was at his kitchen table grading papers when she called. He told her he had time. "My head of physical security," she said. "He'd been with me for 2 years. He was the one who altered the rotation, who told them which credentials to duplicate, who mapped the ballroom layout for them." A pause. "And my executive assistant. She'd been with the company for 4 years. She'd been feeding them my schedule, my movements, my security protocols for 8 months. Logan set down his pen. "I'm sorry. I keep, She stopped. Started again. "I keep running back through every interaction, every meeting, looking for the moment I should have seen it." Another pause, shorter. "I know that's not useful." "No," he agreed. "But it's human. You'd be strange if you weren't doing it." "My security consultant says the same thing." A beat. "He also says I need to rebuild the entire security infrastructure from the ground up, which is probably true and also feels like standing in the middle of a house that burned down and being handed a hammer." "Where do you start with the hammer?" She was quiet for a moment. "That's actually why I called." He heard her exhale, not quite a sigh. The exhale of someone choosing to be direct when being indirect would be easier. "I'd like to offer you a consulting position, security advisory. You'd have complete latitude to assess and make recommendations. The compensation would be—" "Victoria," he said. She stopped. "I'm a history teacher," he said. "I coach JV soccer on Thursdays. My daughter is in 3rd grade and she needs me home for dinner." A silence. "I know that." "I'm not saying no," he said. "I'm saying I'm not your guy for a full advisory role, but I can give you 3 days and a written assessment of your current vulnerabilities, and I can give you the names of 2 people I trust who do this professionally and would do it well." The silence was different now. 3 days. Evenings and 1 weekend. I can do it in a month. "That's not what I was offering," she said. He could hear her working something out. "But I'll take it." "The names matter more than the 3 days," he said. "Get the right people in place, and you won't need me." "You don't want to be needed," she said, and it wasn't an accusation, just an observation. "I want to teach history and raise my kid," he said. "Those aren't small things." "No," she said after a moment. "They're not." He went to Hawthorne Capital Group on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after the gala. The offices were in a tower downtown, 42nd floor, the kind of space that had been designed to communicate permanence and confidence, and which currently communicated those things slightly less effectively because 2 conference rooms had been converted to temporary security operations centers, and there were new access control panels on every door that still had the installer's tape on them. Victoria met him in the lobby herself, which surprised him. She was in work clothes, dark blazer, no jewelry except the watch. And she looked like she'd been in the building since 7 in the morning, which she probably had. "You didn't have to come down," he said. "I know," she said. She offered her hand and he shook it, and there was a moment of mild awkwardness that was the natural consequence of 2 people who had met in the context of genuine crisis and were now negotiating what a normal interaction looked like. "Thank you for coming." "Show me what you have," he said, because starting with the work was easier than starting with anything else. She showed him. She walked him through the existing security infrastructure with the same precise economy she'd used in the ballroom, and he asked the questions that occurred to him and she answered them without defensiveness, which he respected. The vulnerabilities were real, and several of them were serious, and one of them, a gap in the access logging for the executive floor that had apparently existed for 18 months, made him set down his coffee cup. "Nobody caught this," he said. "No. Your head of security at the time was the man who helped them plan the operation," she said. "So either he created the gap deliberately or he never bothered to find it because it didn't serve him to." She paused. "I prefer the second explanation." "Why?" Because the first means he was planning this from the day he was hired, and I'm not ready to believe I missed something that systematic for 2 years. Logan looked at her. You might have to believe it eventually. I know. She picked up his coffee cup and walked it to the small side table where the coffee service was. I'm giving myself until the trial, then I'll believe whatever the evidence supports. It was an honest answer. He wrote it in the margin of his notes, not as a note about security protocols, but as a note about her, which he was aware of doing and didn't entirely explain to himself. They worked for 3 hours that first evening. He took notes, and she talked, and occasionally one of her remaining senior staff came in to answer a specific operational question. By the time they finished, Logan had 14 pages of notes, and a preliminary assessment that he would spend the next 2 weeks turning into something structured and actionable. At 9:15, Victoria walked him to the elevator, and they stood in the corridor waiting for it to come. How's Cora? She asked. He looked at her. He'd mentioned Cora once, briefly, in the ballroom. She's good. She wants to be a marine biologist this week. Last week it was an architect. What was it the week before? A horse, he said. Victoria smiled. It was the first fully unguarded expression he'd seen on her face. Not managed, not performed, just a smile that arrived without apparent planning. It changed her face considerably, and he noticed this with the same automatic attention he noticed most things, and then declined to examine further. The reading program coordinator, Ms. Del Rey, Victoria said. I met with her last week. She told me about Cora. What did she tell you? That she reads above her grade level by about 2 years, and that she has very strong opinions about which books deserve to exist and which ones don't. She's 8, Logan said. She told me last month that a book she didn't like was a waste of paper in someone's life. Direct quote. That's a critic in the making. That's what I'm afraid of, he said, and the elevator arrived. He stepped in and turned. She was standing in the corridor with her arms crossed loosely over her chest, not the defensive crossing of someone guarding themselves, but the comfortable crossing of someone who was cold or simply at ease. The fluorescent light of the office corridor was not flattering to anyone, and she looked tired in it, the kind of tired that accumulated over weeks rather than days. Get some sleep, he said. I'll sleep when the access logging is fixed. That'll be done by Thursday if your IT team is any good. They're excellent, she said. I just like having a concrete goal. The elevator doors started to close, and he put his hand out to hold them. Victoria. She looked at him. The people who did this. The corporate people, not the hired team. They bet that you'd fold. He paused. They were wrong about you from the beginning. She was quiet for a moment. The exhaustion in her face didn't leave, but something behind it shifted. Not comfort exactly, just the particular quality of hearing something true. Thank you for that, she said. He let the elevator doors close. The trial, or rather, the series of trials, because the legal process subdivided the conspirators across multiple proceedings with separate charges and separate timelines, would take the better part of a year to fully resolve. Logan knew this because Reyes had told him so during their last formal interview, and because he'd done enough reading about corporate criminal conspiracy cases to understand the pace. He would be called to testify. He'd been told to expect it, and had filed this information in the same place he filed things he couldn't control, and therefore declined to spend energy worrying about. What happened in the interim was quieter and more ordinary and more sustaining. He went back to his classroom on Monday mornings. He taught the First World War, and then the Second, and then Korea, and when he taught Korea, he spent more time than he usually did on the soldiers who came home to ordinary lives and chose to stay there, who decided that the ordinary life was not a consolation prize, but the actual thing. And his students were 16 and didn't fully understand why their teacher seemed personally invested in this particular point, but some of them felt the weight of it anyway. He coached JV soccer on Thursdays. His team was competent rather than talented, which he considered an honest reflection of life. And he liked them for their competence and for the specific effort that competent people had to make, that talented people didn't always need to. The assistant coach was a PE teacher named Frank, who brought terrible coffee and excellent judgment, and they stood on the sideline together in the October cold and argued pleasantly about formations. He made dinner for Cora. He helped her with her homework, which was becoming more interesting as she moved through 3rd grade into material that had actual content, fractions, early American history, the life cycle of plants, which she found disappointing because she'd hoped it would involve more drama. He read to her at night, or she read to him. And on the night she read to him, he sat in the chair by her bed and listened to her work through the sentences with the deliberate pleasure of someone who had figured out that reading was a form of power. And he thought about the reading program in Ms. Del Rey and the chain of small decisions that had put Cora in that program and put him at the gala on a Tuesday night in October with a rented tuxedo and a borrowed jacket. He thought about these chains sometimes, the way things connected. He delivered his written assessment to Victoria on a Friday evening 5 weeks after the gala. It ran to 31 pages, single-spaced, with diagrams of the access control gaps and a recommended vendor list and a 6-month implementation timeline that he'd benchmarked against 2 comparable organizations he'd researched. He'd spent more time on it than 3 days, technically, but he'd done most of the additional work between 9 and 11 at night after Cora was in bed, so he chose not to count it. Victoria read it over the weekend and called him on Monday morning during his free period. "This is thorough," she said. "It's what you needed." "The vendor recommendations? You know these people personally?" "The first one, yes. We serve together. He runs a legitimate operation and he doesn't cut corners." A pause. "The second is a referral from Callahan, so I'd trust it." "How is Arthur?" "Better. He had a cardiac workup the week after the gala. His doctor told him the stress event probably hadn't helped but hadn't caused any measurable damage. He seemed disappointed by the lack of drama." Logan paused. "He asks about you." "Tell him I'm going to call him," she said. "I keep meaning to, and then something intervenes." "I'll tell him." A silence that wasn't uncomfortable. The school corridor outside his classroom door had the ambient noise of passing period, lockers, voices, the specific percussion of teenagers in transit, and he sat at his desk and watched it through the small window in the classroom door. "There's something else," Victoria said. "I want to talk to you about it in person, but I wanted to flag it first so it wasn't a surprise." "Okay." "I'm starting a foundation, separate from my corporate work. It'll be focused on children and single-parent families, direct support, educational resources, crisis stabilization." A pause. "That night changed what I want to do with the parts of my life that aren't the company. I've been thinking about it for 5 weeks and I'm certain about it." Logan said nothing, waiting. "I want you to consider being an advisor, not a security role. I have the right people in place for that now because of your assessment. This is different. This is someone who understands what it actually means to raise a child through hard circumstances, and what families need and what actually helps versus what looks like helping." Another pause. "You don't have to answer now." "I know," he said. "I just wanted you to know it was coming." He sat with it for a moment. Through the classroom door window, he could see the corridor clearing as passing period ended, students disappearing into rooms, the hall going from loud to quiet in the compressed way of school buildings. A girl in a yellow jacket was the last one in the corridor, running, backpack bouncing, and she made it through a door at the far end just before it fully closed. "I'll think about it," he said. That's all I'm asking." Matt. Callahan called him that evening, which was unusual. They'd exchanged numbers after the gala, but had spoken only twice, both times at Logan's initiation. "I heard from a friend at the DA's office," Callahan said, without preamble, which was his preferred conversational style. "The 2 corporate principals behind the financing have been indicted. Formally. It'll be in the news tomorrow morning." Logan was in the kitchen making Cora's lunch for the next day, a task he performed every evening with the specific organizational focus that he applied to most domestic operations, because if he didn't make the lunch the night before, something always went wrong with the morning. "How solid is the case?" "Very solid. The forensic financial work took them straight to the source. 2 of the 6 in custody from the hotel made substantial cooperation agreements that included naming the financiers directly." A pause. "The 2 insiders, her security chief and the assistant, have already pled. Sentencing in February." "How is she handling it?" "Ms. Hawthorne." A beat. "I had coffee with her last week. She's handling it the way she handles everything, which is to say better than most people would, and at some personal cost that she doesn't talk about." Another pause, shorter. "She mentioned you." What did she say? She said you gave her an assessment that she described as, and I'm quoting here, the most useful document I've received in 5 years of running a company, which coming from her I would take as significant. Callahan's voice had a slight warmth in it that hadn't been there during the gala. She also said you turned down the full advisory role. I did, but not the foundation. Logan stopped slicing the apple he'd been slicing. She told you about the foundation. She asked my opinion on things. I've apparently become advisory in my retirement without fully intending to. A brief pause. The foundation is a real idea, Logan. It's not a vanity project. She's thought through the actual mechanics of it. The funding model, the service gaps it addresses, the organizational structure. I've seen the preliminary documents. A beat. She wants people around it who have actual standing to understand what it would serve. I have a full-time job, Logan said. I know, she knows. She's not asking you to quit teaching. Callahan paused. She's asking you to believe that what you have to contribute is worth contributing. Logan thought about this. He put the apple slices in the container and snapped the lid and set it in the lunchbox and stood at the kitchen counter for a moment. You took the meeting with her, he said. I did. And you're calling me. I'm calling you, Callahan confirmed. That's not subtle, Arthur. No, Callahan agreed with the tone of a man who was fully aware of this and had made a deliberate choice. It's not. I've been subtle for 30 years professionally, and I find I have less patience for it in retirement. A pause. Talk to her, Logan. Whatever you decide, just talk to her. He put the lunchbox in the refrigerator. From the other room, he could hear Cora's television. She was allowed 1 hour after dinner. A nature documentary. From the sound of it, something about ocean creatures that she'd been watching in an intense ongoing series for the past 2 weeks. I'll talk to her, he said. He meant it. He hung up and went to sit with Cora for the last 20 minutes of her TV hour. Because that was also something he did. Because the ordinary things and the important things were frequently the same thing, and he had learned not to choose between them. The meeting with Victoria happened on a Wednesday late afternoon at a coffee shop that was equidistant between his school and her office building. Not the Meridian. Neither of them had suggested the Meridian. She was there when he arrived, which he'd somehow expected, sitting at a corner table with a coffee she'd already started and her phone face down on the table, which he'd learned was a Victoria Hawthorne signal for, "You have my complete attention." He sat down across from her and a server appeared and he ordered coffee, and then they were sitting across from each other in an ordinary coffee shop in the afternoon light, and it struck him, not for the first time, how different she looked outside of the context in which he'd seen her. Not smaller. That wasn't it. Just more present, somehow. Less filtered by the ambient demands of the situation she was usually managing. Arthur called me after he called you, she said. I figured. He said to tell you that the Steinbeck collection is still available if Cora wants to borrow it. She'll take him up on that, Logan said. Then she'll have opinions about Steinbeck that she'll want to discuss at length. He's aware. He seemed pleased about it. The coffee arrived. Logan wrapped both hands around the mug, which was warm in the particular satisfying way of ceramic mugs, and looked at her. Tell me about the foundation, he said. She did. She talked for 20 minutes, which was longer than he'd expected. And it wasn't a pitch. She wasn't selling it, wasn't performing enthusiasm, was just describing it the way she described everything, with the specificity of someone who had thought about it carefully and followed each implication to its next logical step. The model was solid. The service gaps it addressed were real. He knew they were real because he'd lived inside some of them for 2 years after Rachel died. The months when there was no money for childcare and no family close by, and no institutional support that wasn't contingent on a level of crisis he hadn't yet reached. The support that arrived before the crisis, that was the gap. The foundation was aimed at the gap. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The families you're targeting, he said. The single-parent households in financial distress. What's the intake process? She walked him through it. He asked 2 more questions. She answered both of them without hesitation. You've already built the intake model, he said. Preliminary version. It needs real-world stress testing. You need people who've been through the intake process of other systems, he said, or through no system at all. You need that perspective built into the design. Yes, she said, That's exactly what I need. Logan looked at his coffee. I can do Tuesday evenings, and one Saturday a month, maybe two. She was quiet for a moment. That's more than I asked for. The intake model is the most important part, he said. If you get that wrong, nothing downstream works right. I want to see it through. She held his gaze. Why? It was a real question. She wasn't being rhetorical or performative. She was asking because she genuinely wanted to know, and it was the kind of question that deserved an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. Because Cora needed something like this and didn't have it, he said. And because I can read a room well enough to know when something is real versus when it's designed to look real. He paused. This is real. Victoria looked at him for a long moment in the afternoon light of the coffee shop, and the expression on her face was not the composed, professional expression and not the unguarded smile from the office corridor. It was something between them, honest and a little tired and entirely unperformed. Tuesday evenings, she said. And the Saturdays. And the Saturdays, she agreed. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities did in late November. Moving fast, collars up, the particular purposeful hurry of people who wanted to be somewhere warmer. And inside the coffee shop, it was warm and the light was good, and Logan Pierce sat across from Victoria Hawthorne and thought about nothing in particular for a moment, which was unusual for him and also, strangely, exactly right. The sentencing hearings happened in February, as Reyes had predicted, and Logan attended both of them. He hadn't been required to. His testimony had been delivered in December, a 2-hour deposition in a conference room at the DA's office that had been precise and unremarkable. The kind of testimony that didn't make for dramatic courtroom moments, but made prosecutors happy because it was clean and specific and didn't require management. He could have stayed home. He went anyway, because he felt that some things deserved to be witnessed in person, and the completion of a process was one of them. The courtroom was smaller than people imagined courtrooms to be when they hadn't been in one. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, the particular institutional smell of a building that processed too many people to stay neutral. Raymond Holt, the former head of Victoria's physical security team, sat at the defendant's table in a suit that was slightly too large for him, and Logan watched him and felt nothing in particular. Not anger, which he'd expected might visit him in this room, and not satisfaction, which he'd also considered. Just the flat acknowledgement of a thing that had happened and was now being formally addressed. Holt received 4 years. Claire Ashworth, the former executive assistant, received 2 years and 3 months, with credit for time served and a cooperation agreement that had helped the prosecution considerably. She was 29 years old and she cried when the sentence was read, which Logan watched with the complicated feeling of someone who understood that a person could do a genuinely harmful thing and still be something more than the harmful thing they'd done. It didn't excuse it. It just made the world accurate. Victoria was present for both hearings, seated 3 rows ahead of Logan on the opposite side of the aisle. She sat with the stillness of someone who had made a decision to be here and was committed to it, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed but not closed. She was present in a way that cost her something, and she wasn't hiding that it cost her. When the Ashworth sentence was read, Victoria looked at her former assistant for a long moment with an expression that Logan couldn't fully read from where he was sitting, and that was probably appropriate because it wasn't his expression to read. Afterward, they stood on the courthouse steps in the February cold, their breath visible in the gray morning air, the city going about its ordinary business on the street below. "How do you feel?" Logan asked. Victoria thought about it. She was wearing a dark coat and no scarf, and the cold had put color in her face that the courtroom hadn't. "Like something is finished," she said. "Not over. I know the corporate trials still have months to go, but this part." She paused. "These were the people I knew. Whatever comes next is people I never met who made decisions about me in a boardroom. That's different. Is different better or worse?" "I genuinely don't know," she said. "Ask me in 6 months." He would, he thought. That was a new development in his life, the specific certainty that he would be talking to this person in 6 months, that there was a continuity now that hadn't existed before October. He'd been surprised by it gradually, the way you were surprised by things that accumulated rather than announced themselves. A gust of wind came down the courthouse steps, and Victoria pulled her coat tighter. I hate February, she said, with a candor that was different from her public voice. It's the shortest month, Logan said. It doesn't feel like it. No, he agreed. It never does. The Hawthorne Family Resilience Foundation launched publicly in March at an event that was the deliberate opposite of the Hargrove Gala in almost every respect. A daytime gathering in a community center on the east side of the city, folding tables and coffee in paper cups, and a room full of social workers and case managers and parents who'd been through the intake process in the foundation's 4-month pilot and were here because they'd been asked what was working and what wasn't. Logan had helped design the feedback session. He'd argued for it against Victoria's communications director, who wanted a traditional press launch with media presence, and Victoria had overruled her director, which Logan had watched happen with the specific interest of someone who'd seen her manage a room under pressure and was curious about how she managed one under normal conditions. The answer was differently, but with the same fundamental directness. The feedback session was unglamorous and occasionally uncomfortable and entirely useful. A woman named Denise, who had 3 children and had lost her job in the same month her husband left, told the room that the foundation's emergency childcare subsidy had been the difference between keeping her apartment and not, and she said it without performance, just fact, and the room was quiet in the way rooms went quiet when something true was said plainly. A man named Greg, who had a daughter with a medical condition that required ongoing specialist care, said the insurance navigation support had saved him approximately 40 hours he didn't have. He said he'd spent 3 of those hours sleeping, which he hadn't done in one stretch in 6 months. And he said it with the specific, exhausted humor of someone who'd learned to find the funny parts of impossible situations because the alternative was only impossible. Logan sat at the end of the row nearest the wall and listened to all of it and took notes on a legal pad in the compressed handwriting he used when he was moving fast. And the notes were not about the foundation's performance metrics, but about the specific texture of what people said when you asked them what had actually helped versus what had seemed like it might help from the outside. These were different lists. The gap between them was where most institutional support fell. Victoria moved through the room during the break with the attentive quality she brought to everything, not performing interest, actually having it. He watched her crouch down to talk to a 4-year-old who had come with her mother and was sitting under a table with a juice box in apparent perfect contentment, and Victoria said something that made the child laugh, which was not a skill possessed by everyone, and the child's mother looked up with the expression of someone who had expected this person to be impressive and was being surprised by the specific form the impressiveness took. During the break, Callahan appeared at Logan's elbow. "You look like you're analyzing something," Callahan said. "I'm always analyzing something. The good news is, it doesn't show." Callahan sat in the adjacent chair with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been managing his cardiac situation with more conscientiousness since February, which Logan approved of. "This is working," he said, meaning the room, the session, the foundation's first real public accountability moment. "It's a good start," Logan said, which was his honest assessment. "The intake model needs another revision. There are still people falling through the window between crisis-level need and ongoing support. We're catching them at the acute moment, and then the follow-through is inconsistent." "You've told her this." "I've told her. She's working on it." He paused. "She works fast when she decides something matters." "She does," Callahan agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "And you, Logan? How are you?" Logan considered the question. He was aware that Callahan asked it with more specificity than the social version. The old man wanted an actual answer. "I'm good," he said. And then, because Callahan deserved more than 2 words, "Better than I expected to be this far out from October." "These things have a way of settling differently than you think they will." "Yeah." He looked at the room, at Denise talking to one of the foundation's case managers, at Greg getting a second cup of coffee, at the child under the table who had now been joined by another child and was apparently explaining the juice box situation in considerable detail. "I thought it would sit heavier, the gala, the aftermath. Does it not?" "It sits where it belongs," Logan said. "Which is further back than I thought it would be." He paused. "That's new for me. Usually things sit forward." Callahan was quiet for a moment. "That's not the gala," he said. "That's time, and the right things to come home to." Logan didn't answer because the answer felt private, and Callahan nodded as though he'd heard it anyway, and they sat together in the comfortable silence of two people who had been in a difficult room together and had come out the other side and didn't need to narrate it. The corporate trials concluded in late April and early May, across two separate proceedings that ran simultaneously in the same courthouse where Logan had watched the sentencing hearings in February. He didn't attend these. They were longer, denser, requiring the specific fluency in financial law that he didn't have, and that the prosecution handled with considerable skill. He followed the coverage in the mornings before school, reading the reports with his coffee while Cora ate breakfast across from him, her nose in a book. Steinbeck, as it happened, the Callahan loan having been accepted and enthusiastically processed. The two principal architects of the operation, the executives at Vantage Group International, who had financed and directed the kidnapping scheme, were convicted in the first week of May. The convictions covered conspiracy to commit kidnapping, corporate fraud, and several counts related to the financing of criminal activity. The sentences were substantial, the kind that would occupy a significant portion of the remainder of the men's professional lives. Logan read about it on a Thursday morning and then drove to school and taught his first period class, which was in the middle of the Cold War. And he asked his students to think about what happened when institutions prioritized the consolidation of power over the welfare of people, and what forms that took when it was governments doing it versus corporations versus individuals, and whether the mechanisms were really as different as they appeared or whether power had a consistent grammar regardless of who was speaking it. His students, who were 16, engaged with this with variable enthusiasm, which was appropriate. He taught 3 more classes, coached soccer in the afternoon, drove home, made dinner, helped Cora with a fraction worksheet that was giving her trouble on the conceptual level rather than the procedural level, which required a different kind of explanation, and then sat at his kitchen table after she was in bed and read the full verdict coverage in quiet. He felt, finishing it, something that took him a moment to identify. Not closure exactly. Closure was a word people used for things that were actually just distance, and distance was not the same thing, more like completion. The sense of a shape that had been unfinished for 7 months finally coming to its last line. He set his phone down on the kitchen table and sat for a while in the quiet of the house, and thought about nothing specific, and then thought about Rachel, which happened still, and which he had stopped being surprised by, because grief didn't operate on the schedule that people expected it to, and the woman he'd married deserved to be thought about whenever the thought arrived. He thought about the specific way she'd laughed at her own jokes before she delivered the punchline, which had driven him a little crazy and which he had not told anyone and did not plan to, because some things were private in a way that was not about secrecy, but about belonging. Then he washed his coffee cup, checked the locks, and went to bed. In the second week of May, Cora came home from school with a drawing she'd made in art class. It was technically an assignment, a self-portrait, but Cora had interpreted the assignment with the specific latitude that she tended to apply to instructions she found too narrow. The drawing was of her and Logan at the park. She was in the air at the apex of a swing arc, which she'd captured with the kind of energy that children's drawings had and adult drawings mostly lost. Purely gestural, the energy of the moment rather than the accuracy of it. Logan was behind her in mid-push, and she'd given him a face that was more accurate than he expected. The specific slight squint he had when he was outside and the light was bright. "This was supposed to be a self-portrait," he said. "I'm in it," she said reasonably. "I'm the one in the air." He put it on the refrigerator. He had a section of the refrigerator that was dedicated to her drawings, held up by a rotating set of magnets, and this one went in the center because the composition was, honestly, quite good. "Ms. Delray says the foundation is going to fund the summer reading expansion," Cora said, from the table where she was eating an apple with the contemplative focus she brought to apples. "I know. Did you help with that?" "A little." Cora chewed her apple. "The lady, Ms. Hawthorne. She came to the program last week. Ms. Delray introduced her." Logan turned from the refrigerator. "I didn't know she was going." "She was nice," Cora said. "She talked to everyone. She didn't just stand in the front and talk. She went around and sat with people." A pause. "She sat with me for a while." "What did you talk about?" "Steinbeck," Cora said. "She's read all of them." She said, of mice and men made her cry the first time, and the second time, and she thinks it will every time. She took another bite of apple. I told her I hadn't read that one yet, but Mr. Callahan said I could borrow it next. She said I should be ready. Logan leaned against the counter and looked at his daughter, who was 8 years old and eating an apple and had apparently had a conversation with Victoria Hawthorne about Steinbeck and taken it completely in stride, the way she took most things in stride, because she had been born with a fundamental equanimity that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with her own nature. She didn't tell me she was going, he said, mostly to himself. Maybe she just wanted to see it, Cora said, without it being a thing. He looked at his 8-year-old. When did you get so perceptive? I've always been perceptive, she said with complete seriousness. You just don't always notice. He couldn't argue with this, so he didn't. He called Victoria that evening. She picked up on the third ring, which was later than usual. She typically picked up fast, the habit of someone who managed her own communications and didn't let things accumulate. You visited the reading program, he said. A brief pause. Cora told you. Cora told me. I should have mentioned it, she said. It felt like the kind of thing that turned into a bigger deal if I announced it beforehand, so I just went. You sat with her for a while. Logan, she's remarkable. She told me about a book she was reading, and then she told me what was wrong with the ending. And the critique was completely legitimate. She's 8. She's been doing that since she could read, he said. I've learned to agree with her on the endings. Victoria laughed. It was the unguarded version, the one that arrived without warning, the one he'd heard more of over the past 7 months than she probably intended. I liked her very much, she said. I hope that's all right to say. It's all right to say. A comfortable pause. Through the kitchen window, he could see the neighbor's light across the backyard, yellow in the May dark. The verdicts, she said. How did you feel when you read it? Finished, he said. Not clean, just finished. Yes, she said. That's the word. A pause. I thought I'd feel more. When the verdicts came in, I was in a board meeting, and someone passed me a note, and I read it, and I thought, I should feel more than this. And then I realized what I actually felt was that I could move forward without looking over my shoulder, which is not dramatic, but it might be the most valuable thing. The undramatic things usually are, Logan said. That sounds like something you'd say in a history class. I probably have. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Not softer exactly, but more careful, like someone choosing words for their accuracy rather than their ease. Can I ask you something? Yeah. When we were in the ballroom, when I came across the room and found you, what made you stay? A pause. You had a daughter at home. You had every reason to find a way to be helpful that didn't involve what you did. What made you decide to go all the way in? He thought about it. He'd thought about this question before in various forms, at various hours, and he had more than one answer, and none of them were entirely complete. Because the situation was real, he said finally, and because the people in that room were real, and because I've spent enough time in circumstances where someone made the decision to go all the way in, and it was the reason people came home. He paused. You can't half do the thing. If you're in, you're in. That's just how it works for me. Does it always work that way for you? For the things that matter, he said. Yeah. Another pause, longer this time, and he let it be long because some silences were conversations in themselves, and this one was. Tuesday, she said finally. The intake model revision. I'll be there at 6, he said. I'll have better coffee than last time. Last time was fine. It was not fine, she said. It was the office machine. I'll bring something from the place on Kimball Street. The one with the line out the door? The line moves fast, she said. It's worth it. He smiled, which she couldn't see, and which he wasn't self-conscious about. Okay, he said. Kimball Street coffee, 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, she confirmed. He hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a while after. The house was quiet around him, the specific quiet of a house where a child was asleep, which was different from other kinds of quiet, fuller somehow, despite the absence of noise. He'd learned to like this quiet after Rachel died, when he'd first understood that it didn't have to feel like emptiness, that it could feel like the pause between things instead. The refrigerator hummed. The drawing was there on its door in the center position, Cora in the air above the swing, and Logan behind her, caught mid-push, squinting into the light. But there was something Logan had come to believe, across the years, that had brought him from a Navy SEAL to a history teacher to a man sitting in a hotel ballroom in a too-tight rented tuxedo, that he hadn't been able to articulate cleanly until that particular May evening, in the quiet of his own kitchen, looking at a child's drawing on a refrigerator door. Strength was not what he'd been taught it was when he was young. He'd been trained in a version of strength that was about threshold, how much you could take, how long you could hold, how far you could push past the point where other people stopped. That kind of strength was real, and he'd needed it, and he didn't regret learning it. But it was strength in one direction. It was strength as endurance. The other kind was harder to see because it was quieter. It was the strength of Callahan at 67, falling on purpose in a dark ballroom to buy 2 seconds for someone who needed them, and then sitting back down and doing it anyway despite a heart that had been giving him trouble since 2019. It was the strength of Victoria Hawthorne holding a microphone in the dark, making her voice do what her body couldn't, keeping 300 people from becoming a chaos that would have given the men with guns exactly what they needed. It was the strength of a woman named Denise, in a folding chair in a community center, saying plainly and without drama that a subsidy check had been the difference between her children having a home and not having one, and choosing to say it in a room of strangers because it might help the next person who needed it. It was the strength of coming back to the ordinary thing. Pancakes on Sunday morning, the homework that needed explaining in a different way, the drawing on the refrigerator, the Tuesday evening at 6 o'clock that was already in the calendar for next week. Logan had spent a long time believing that the life he lived after the Navy, the teaching, the parenting, the JV soccer, and the morning coffee, and the particular light that came through the east-facing kitchen window, was the smaller life, the life that had replaced the larger one when the larger one became unavailable. He had not been unhappy about this. He'd found in it a genuine and sustaining satisfaction, but he'd held it as the secondary thing. He didn't think that anymore. He thought the life that was organized around coming home was the original life, the one that all the other capacities, the training, the tactics, the ability to read a room in the dark, existed to protect. Not as a means to an end, as the end itself. The ballroom had not changed him. It had shown him something he'd already become. On a Saturday in late May, Logan took Cora to meet Callahan. They drove to the old man's house, a craftsman bungalow in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of house that had been continuously inhabited and cared for and therefore had the specific warmth of a place that was genuinely lived in rather than maintained. Callahan opened the door before they reached it, which meant he'd been watching for them, which Logan filed under the things about Arthur Callahan that were endearing without him appearing to intend them. Cora evaluated the house from the front walk with the aesthetic seriousness she applied to new environments. "He has a lot of plants," she said. "He does," Logan confirmed. "Is he good at keeping them alive?" "I have no idea." She accepted this and went up the front steps. The Steinbeck collection was on a shelf in Callahan's study, where they were taken after coffee and a prolonged conversation in the living room, during which Cora asked Callahan 3 questions about his career that he answered with a careful balance of honesty and appropriate vagueness, and which she received with the concentrated attention of someone storing information for later use. She stood in front of the shelf and looked at the books with the reverence that she reserved for things that mattered to her, which was not many things, but the things that were on the list were on it permanently. "Of Mice and Men," she said, locating it. She looked at Callahan. "Miss Hawthorne said I should be ready." "Miss Hawthorne is right," Callahan said. "Read it in one sitting if you can. Don't let yourself stop in the middle." Cora nodded seriously. She selected the book and held it in both hands and said, "I'll be careful with it." "I know you will," Callahan said. He looked at Logan over Cora's head with an expression that was complicated and warm, and that Logan returned with a slight nod. They stayed for 2 hours. On the way home, Cora read the first chapter in the car. She could read in moving vehicles without getting sick, which Logan had always considered an unfair advantage. And when they pulled into the driveway, she marked her page with the precision of a child who understood that books were to be handled correctly. And she got out, and she went inside, and she went directly to her room to continue reading. Logan sat in the driveway for a moment after she went in. The afternoon was warm, a real May warmth, the kind that arrived in the late afternoon and had the quality of something promised rather than accidental. He sat with the car window down and thought about the fact that his daughter was inside reading a book borrowed from a retired intelligence officer she'd just met. A book recommended by a CEO who'd sat with her at a reading program table and talked about Steinbeck with the specificity of genuine love for the work. He thought about how none of this had been planned, how the entire chain, the gala, the whispered help me, the jammer, and the sound booth and the stairwell, the coffee shop on the equidistant corner, the Tuesday evenings, the community center in March, Victoria sitting down across the room at a folding table to talk about books, had emerged from a single decision to pay attention in a ballroom on a Tuesday night in October. He was not by nature a person who believed the universe arranged things. He was a person who believed that attention created opportunity, and that courage was what you did when the opportunity arrived, and that the rest was the result of choosing, consistently and over time, to show up to the things that mattered. But he was also, quietly and without making a theory of it, grateful. Victoria came to the park on a Sunday in early June. It was not a planned thing, or it was planned, but casually, the way things got planned now between them, which was to say that one of them mentioned it, and the other said yes, and then it happened. She arrived in jeans and a jacket, her hair down, which he'd seen a handful of times, and which still registered as a different person in some low-level perceptual way that he'd stopped trying to analyze. Cora was on the swings when they arrived. She saw Victoria from the swing and waved without stopping. A single decisive wave, the wave of someone who has been informed someone is coming and is now confirming receipt, and then went back to the serious business of the highest possible arc. Victoria stood next to Logan and watched. "Does she always go that high?" "Higher than that, usually," he said. "She's showing off." "How can you tell?" "She's glancing over here." Victoria looked. Cora was, in fact, glancing over, with the studied casualness of someone attempting not to be caught glancing. "She is," Victoria said. "She does it when there's someone she wants to impress," Logan said. "She's subtle about most things. This is not one of them." "I'm flattered," Victoria said, and she meant it. They sat on a bench at the edge of the playground in the June morning, and the conversation moved in the unhurried way that conversations moved when the people having them had spent enough time together to not need to fill every pause. They talked about the Foundation's second quarter numbers, which were better than projected. They talked about a case manager who had flagged a systemic gap in the medical referral process that needed addressing. They talked about Callahan's decision to formally join the Foundation's advisory board, which had been announced the week before, and which Callahan had described to Logan as coming out of retirement against my better judgment, but in favor of my actual judgment. At some point, Cora abandoned the swings and came to the bench and stood in front of Victoria with the directness she used when she had something she wanted to say. "I've finished it," she said. Victoria looked at her. "How do you feel?" "Like you said," Cora said. "Both times." Victoria nodded slowly. "You can't fix the ending," she said. "That's the whole point." "I know," Cora said. "That's what makes it true." She went back to the playground. Logan watched her go, and then he looked at the sky, which was the specific blue of a good June morning, and then he looked at Victoria, who was watching Cora with an expression that was entirely unmanaged and entirely her own. "She's going to be something," Victoria said. "She already is," Logan said. "She's 8. She's everything she's going to be, just in a smaller version." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Do you ever worry about her, that you won't be enough on your own?" It was a real question, asked carefully, and it deserved the honest answer. "Every day," he said. "But worrying isn't the same as failing. I just have to keep showing up and doing it better than I did the day before. That's all any of it is." She looked at him. "Is that what you tell your students?" "Sometimes. When they're worried, they're not enough for something." He paused. "It's also what I believe." The morning stayed warm around them. Across the playground, Cora had found another child and was explaining something with considerable authority. The swing physics, possibly, or the Steinbeck, or something else entirely. And the other child was listening with the expression of someone who had encountered a force of nature and was deciding how to respond. The verdicts were done. The foundation was running. The insiders had been sentenced, and the financiers convicted, and the hired team was where it belonged, and the merger had closed without incident in February. Hawthorne Capital's legal team had moved fast, and the competing parties had found themselves without leverage and without time. Victoria had rebuilt her security infrastructure from the assessment Logan had provided, and it was better now, genuinely better, the kind of better that came from building something correctly after understanding specifically what had failed and why. None of these were small things. They were large, consequential, real. But they were also finished in the way that Reyes had described the sentencing. Finished, not erased, but placed in the past where they belonged. What remained was this: the bench in the park, the June morning. A girl on a playground explaining something important to someone who was only now learning to listen. Two people sitting side by side who had met in the worst possible circumstances and discovered, slowly and without drama, that the person they'd met in that room was the same person they found in every ordinary room after. Logan thought about the word home. He'd thought about it a lot over the past 7 months, not sentimentally, just as a practical concept, trying to understand what it actually meant versus what people said it meant. Home as location was easy. Home as feeling was harder to pin down. He thought it was this: the place where you could be exactly what you were without the management of it. The place that didn't require performance. The place where the quiet was full instead of empty. He had it with Cora, had it with her since the terrible and sustaining year after Rachel, when he'd discovered that grief and love were not opposite states, and that he could be devastated and devoted simultaneously, and that the devotion was what carried both of them through. He hadn't expected to find it anywhere else, and he hadn't been looking, because looking wasn't how these things worked. But it was present now, on a bench in a park, in June, in the ordinary morning light. Victoria said, "I keep thinking about what you said that night, in the ballroom, about why you stayed." "Which part?" "The part about not being able to half do the thing." She was looking at the playground. "I think about that a lot." "Yeah?" "I've been half doing some things for a long time," she said. "Not the work I do completely, but other things." She paused. "I'm trying to do them differently." He didn't ask her to be more specific. She hadn't offered specifics, and she didn't need to. The honest shape of the thing was clear enough, and honest shapes didn't require elaboration. "For what it's worth," he said, "you've been full present for everything I've seen you do." "You saw me under pressure first," she said it. "Pressure is easier for me than ordinary." "Welcome to the club," he said. She turned to look at him with a slight surprise, and then she laughed. The real one, unplanned, a little unsteady. And he smiled, and for a moment they were just two imperfect people on a bench in the morning sun, each of them learning the particular skill of the ordinary thing, each of them getting better at it by increments, neither of them pretending it was easy or finished or complete. Across the playground, Cora jumped off the swing at the highest point of the arc, the way she always did, the way that still took years off his life. And she landed in a crouch and stood up and laughed at herself for the wobble. And then she looked over at the bench and she waved, and Logan waved back, and that was the whole of it. The girl in the air,